Hello, everyone, and welcome to a major episode of the War Report. We were, funny enough, actually going to record last night, but I got a little caught up doing other things, so we had to reschedule, which turns out to be, once again, impeccable timing on our part. I can't count the number of times where we have delayed recording only for something major to happen, and
Yeah.
I don't even want to say it because I think you all know, and I think you, being the Minutia Minute guy, deserve the honor of announcing the big news. So do tell everyone what has happened as of today, as of the recording date.
Yes. So before I get into the minutia minute, Bakhmut has fallen. Wagner has taken all of Bakhmut. Yes, including the bottom of Tchaikovsky Street. Um, well, I mean, in some forms, it's written like in the possessive, Tchaikovsky's Street, but it's Tchaikovsky Street, right? Uh, That includes the MiG-17 monument. I believe there was a school or something, not a school, some other government building on the other side. That whole region is called the Samovyot region, next to the Citadel and places like the Horse, the Construct, the Domino. This whole area has like specific names. Anyhow, this last holdout was taken, and the Russians in the extreme west end, where that northern highway that goes on a bend and comes back into Bakhmut, in the next to the town of Chromove or Chromovo. Uh, Chromovo is now being taken by Wagner forces as being uh, combed through just to see if there are any Ukrainian stragglers. But the thing is a lot of there were several people who said, it's too early to tell if uh, the Ukrainians are doing this just to get their guys out of Bakhmut, or they intend to retake Bakhmut by going around it. And I can understand how some people would have thought that would have been difficult. But the main premise for believing that Ukraine was intending to keep Bakhmut and then even retake it by attacking the flanks was that troops were not retreating. But there was a video from a few days ago where Prigozhin is looking at a map. He's talking to this other guy, and he says they're leaving. They're leaving in small groups because they don't want to waste shells on like two or three guys leaving. So the other thing to keep in mind is, the last 3 days, there was less than 1.5 square kilometers of where the Ukrainians could be. Like, there's only so many soldiers you can fit in there. So they're leaving somehow, right? Like, if reinforcements are coming in, someone has to be leaving. And is it a retreat? Well, yeah, it kind of was a retreat. And the Ukrainians were successful in crumbling some of the crumble zones. Remember way back when, after the Russians took Solidar, I said they're going to work on creating these big paths of of um, of territory that they're going to capture because they know that the Ukrainians will not want to give up Bakhmut, but they can't just stay within the city limits or they'll be encircled. Anyhow, that is what happened, and I mean, you know, of course, Russia did retreat, particularly in the southern flank, and they lost men there. They lost one of their colonels in the southern flank and one in the north. But as it turns out, um, some of the fighters that were in the trenches, you get a lot of mixed messages, by the way. Some are saying Wagner abandoned the Russian soldiers. Some are saying the Russians abandoned the Wagner forces. Honestly, I can't even keep track of it. Um, Prigozhin said, when we were in Syria and the Americans killed us with one of their, their gunships, their floating gunships. That was only because they asked the Russians to turn off the S-300 systems. They would never have attacked, right? And they turned them off, and they wasted like over 100 of them, right? That's what Prigozhin claimed. And again, no condemnation from Putin. Putin, in fact, congratulated Prigozhin today for taking Bakhmut. So, and Prigozhin has never been publicly reprimanded for the way he talks about Shoigu or Gerasimov. So anyhow, back to the front. So as it turns out, for the last 2 days, the north and southern flank of Bakhmut were emptying men and concentrating further in Bakhmut city itself. One of the ways that they took it is that they went head on. I will get to the minutia minute for everything else, but the main feature tonight is Bakhmut. So one of the things that the Russians did that is supposed to be reminiscent of the Russian World War II strategy of what's I'm going to get it wrong, but it's a kind of deep penetration into enemy lines, and then you attempt to attack them from the rear, right? So in the
Yes.
Citadel area that I've often described as like a D leaning on its side to like at a 30-degree angle, they went straight in. They bypassed the section that's called Horse, which is just outside of this, and they went into an area that's called the Nest. They went straight in, and I thought they were crazy because some other things have happened, and that is there was testimony from a Wagner fighter that explained how difficult the fighting was. He takes a journalist from RIA Novosti and shows him like one of they call them homes, dom. These are like 5-story buildings, but he also shows him some other ones. Anyhow, he says, you know, what the Ukrainians did is they they shut the first floors, and the basement windows were welded so you couldn't get in. And they would leave a small hole in the stairway where a machine gun would shoot down into the lobby. On the flanks, there would be a sniper and a machine gunner. And he says, "Thank God we took over this building. We only had one wounded guy." Then he points over his shoulder behind him to his right, and he says, "But this 10-meter area, we lost lots of guys here." So you got an idea of how difficult it was, and he showed him. He was very thankful for the tanks. These were the T-90 breakthrough tanks, and so and funny enough, the Washington Post had an article about a Ukrainian describing fighting in Bakhmut and how he said that the tanks are a menace. The reason, well, I mean, there's several reasons, but I would gather one of the reasons is what the Russians were doing with the tanks is they would blow a hole in the side of the building, not the front, but the side. And then that's the way the Russians would infiltrate into the building rather than making the mistake of going up the stairs. The other thing about Bakhmut, I might have said it on the last show or the show before, was how many civilians are still left in Bakhmut? More importantly, how
What
many
is
of
it?
them are.
Still about 4,000? I know it was 4,000 the last time we talked about it a few months back. I imagine it's probably gone
Yeah.
down, but I can't imagine anyone who has stayed there that long would be driven out by really anything else.
Hmm. So I saw 4 separate videos. I cannot confirm, for instance, if in one of the videos the individual who's speaking is speaking and is part of a group from another individual, but I will say I saw 4 videos with different individuals or an individual in each one. All of them describe huddling in the basement. Two of them actually have Wagner forces going into the basement of these high rises. And they're not like high rises, they're more like 10 to 15 stories high, but significant. They're bigger than the little 5 stories, right? And there was a couple that was waiting there, and they said, we'll come back for you in a few hours. We have to clear the way. He says, "No, I want to go right now." He goes, "You can't go right now. They'll kill you." Um, There was another example where I saw no less than 8 people. 3 or 4 of them were children, and the rest were adults. It was very dark. It was only the lamp of one of the Wagner fighters on his helmet that illumined the place, if I remember correctly. This is about 4 or 5 days ago. Anyhow, it was quite dark, and so I was surprised that in this Citadel area that there were still holdouts. Now there are more stories of people in Bakhmut who describe things that we heard in Mariupol, killing of civilians, raiding of supermarkets and drugstores for supplies, and so on and so on. So what appears to have happened is the Russian forces, in conjunction with Wagner, began retreating from the buffer zones. The southern one, which flanked to the south, Chasov Yar, Ivanovskoye, working towards and across there's a channel there towards Konstantinovka, and and in the and in the north, of course, the Ukrainians managed to uh, create this kind of wedge that went far in, but unlike the south, the Ukrainians were able to the Russians were able to keep the highlands, which did not happen in Ukraine until they reached the area of Klesheyevka. So that is a quick summation of Bakhmut. I guess we can get into what we think will happen next, but if you like, I can get into the minutia minute.
Well, I'll just say briefly before I get too much into this to let you get into the minutia minute that you're going to see, and you already are seeing, I should say, the obvious copes that it was a pure Russian victory. They lost so much that it wasn't even worth it. This city wasn't strategically significant, and the assorted takes that you hear whenever the Russians win anything, they trying to downplay it. The NAFO people and their assorted shills, whoever, mainstream media. But clearly, even if it is just symbolic, and I don't believe it is, I think Bakhmut had much more significance, especially when it comes to controlling the high ground. And once again, what's a relatively flat terrain, but still the high ground insofar as that's concerned, is that this took 292 days. Perhaps it shouldn't have. That's
I thought it was
that.
344,
Um,
but yeah,
you might
same
be right. It
distance.
took the better part of a year. Let's just put it that way
9 months.
to take this city, and maybe it shouldn't have. You can talk about the mistakes that were made along the way, but that's irrelevant to the point I'm trying to make here. It's a major breakthrough for the Russians, regardless of whatever happened before. And with, as you'll get into, the way some of the other fronts and some of the other major battles are looking, not much else can really be done in Ukraine's favor, barring an all out counteroffensive with everything they can throw at it. Or some other major game changer of the war, such as a Polish intervention, to return to that. So, with this, and as we get closer to the summer, and as the war does continue, depending on the direction of these next few battles, we're either going to see, and I know this isn't a very in depth take, but I will elaborate later as the show goes on after the Minutia Minute, a marked escalation to the like we have not seen since the start of this war by really either side, because it's getting to that point. Or we will see, on the complete opposite end, the brokering of a ceasefire begin. A genuine one in order to freeze this conflict where it is, because unless they can find something to throw everything they have at the Russians, for example, if they can organize a major Ukrainian counteroffensive, which, with the resources and material, they could probably put quite a dent into the Russians. It's not enough to drive them out, not even enough to drive them out in any significant amount. It would inflict a lot of casualties. It would be a great pain to them, but it's something they could ultimately endure, assuming support for the war effort remains strong at home, which from everything I've seen so far, seems to be the case, and support for the war effort has actually grown over time because of the directions taken, because of the way the rhetoric has gone. But barring that, or barring the intervention of an outside power, which I still have my money on Poland, I think Poland will get involved in this war in at least a much more official capacity before the end of the year. Then we're going to be looking at probably attempts to freeze this conflict where it is, because there's not much else they can do in Ukraine's favor.
Right. And, you bring up Poland, and this relates directly to Bakhmut because, of course, Poland has promised to transfer 29 MiG 29s. I believe 14 of them already entered Ukraine about a week ago. Um, and the mercenaries in Bakhmut. So it looks like most of the mercenaries that stayed fighting to the end were Polish, Turkish, and Georgians.
Oh, I didn't know there
There
was
was also
that many
the,
Turkish mercenaries.
yeah, I was surprised, but
I mean, they're a large military force with a reasonable degree of combat experience given Turkey's foreign policy over the past few decades. So, even if they are just purely soldiers of fortune and have no ideological stake in this, that's not too surprising to hear. But this is actually the first I am hearing of it.
yes, I know. I was pretty surprised as well. Like the Georgians and the Poles and Azov brigade being in there, I'm not surprised.
No, no, not at
Uh,
all.
Actually, six Azov guys were killed in Bakhmut yesterday, according to one of their commanders. It might have been there was a video that showed about 11 or 12 guys getting out of an armored personnel carrier and one of the Soviet era types, and going into like a wrecked house, and then like in 2 seconds, that house gets devastated by a shell, like very precise hit. So I don't know if that was the case or not. Um, so yeah, fighting was extremely intense, and I think if we're gonna stay on Bakhmut for a while, I would say like um, either Prigozhin got that munition really, really fast when he asked for it, or he was never really that short. Um, like I say, if the story is true, and one like I remember reading a take on this, and I remember, and History Legends did a video. I don't know if he cited the same source. He did. It is based on a source. It doesn't say which one, but all to say that he made the same point that it seems the Russians were taking guys out of the crumple zones, the northern and southern flanks, and filling them into the city in order to push into because you know um, the capture of the citadel and all its territories. Honest to God, I think that happened far more quickly than I expected, like far more quickly, and I'm really surprised by that. Um, but we'll get into more like Ukraine battlefront news because there's some articles by Seymour Hersh that are very intriguing. Some of the statements, as you pointed out, for instance, that they could freeze the conflict. There was a Polish officer who said that they would be trying to do that, and it echoes what a Seymour Hersh article had stated, that Poland and the Baltic states want this thing frozen. And of course, the rationale is simple, right? Like um, some American generals have retired, have said, including some NATO uh, officers as well. We're going to, we should freeze this conflict for 2 to 3 years, rebuild NATO, and then, resume. I don't know, like, why would Russia agree to this is beyond me, but, you know.
It's the assumption that they believe their own propaganda about Russia, that they're having the same shortages and the same morale
Yeah.
problem as the West, which is a self-defeating narrative in and of itself, because if they were having these problems, they would not have to freeze the conflict on Ukraine's behalf, and that the pressure of an armed, even just a moderately armed Ukraine would be enough to press Russia into some sort of negotiation or concession on a myriad of issues, honestly.
Well, the other thing we could say is the ruling class of America and the West, the way they deal with domestic issues, domestic problems, is by creating a different perception of those problems, usually by moralizing them away, by uh, we can't fix the border. Why would we? You're a racist. Essentially, that's what the argument is, right? Now, it's more nuanced than that, and it goes back and forth depending on whether it's an election year, depending on whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. But that's essentially what they do most of the time, is they create a new perception. And I think this is the way the war is fought. Um, Give the perception that something is happening that is not, and then if it changes, change the perception again. Um, if you hear a take that contradicts Western media, you can moralize that away. You're a Kremlin stooge, you're a Putin puppet, and all that kind of stuff, right?
That's that's been the go-to since 2016, and I want to wait because there's so much more to cover. But some of the documents that came about RussiaGate this week were also damning. A bit late for it, but still.
Mm.
But I do think it is rather entertaining timing given everything else that's happening, particularly with Russia and Ukraine.
Right. There's that whole Durham thing. I guess we should get into that later on. But also these stupid Discord leaks, right? Ever notice how they just say, according to the leaks. It's like, how many leaks do you have? I mean, these leaks have been going on for 2 months now, almost 2 months. Where are these leaks, right? I mean, they're just making it up. Like, I
Of
found
course.
one new slide this week after weeks of not being able to find any more new leaked slides, right? And again, the information is hardly earth shattering, but it is there to build like an alternative narrative, right? If when and if things go bad, we were wrong about the Russians, or something like that. As soon as if there's a Ukrainian victory, they'll go back, right? Like, it's all a question of perception.
Yes, and I I am interested to see how exactly they take this, because logically, even going back to the question as a whole, whether that be actual action versus media narrative, there's rationally only one way to go, but that way is crossing a point of no return if they do go down that, which is escalating this war beyond what
Yeah.
we've already seen. In which case, that would require some degree of outside intervention. Is that directly American? Is that even directly Western? No. But it requires a large degree of outside intervention if this war is to escalate, because Ukraine, they might have the ability to a counteroffensive comparable to the one we saw last fall, but other than that, they don't have the capacity to do the damage to Russia that their sponsors desire to see them do to Russia.
Right.
So the only other option, if they don't want to go off that ledge, is a ceasefire, is at least some sort of appearance of peace negotiations. And
Right.
I've said previously, and I still maintain this, that they're willing to turn this war into a stop and start war, just have it be a perpetual thorn in Russia's side if they can't get the ideal victory that maybe they would have envisioned in all the way back in 2014, or even as recently as the early months of the war, February, March of 2022.
Hmm. You know, it could be that the freeze of the war exposes a conflict in American strategy with regards to Ukraine before even February 2022. And that is, so a lot of people have said that um, what America wanted the Ukrainians to do was to fight like an insurgent army Afghan style scenario, and that's why they gave them so many javelins, NLAWs, manpads, the whole thing, right? Okay, so here's my problem with that theory. I get that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were trained to fight an insurgent army. And it doesn't mean that there was that the Pentagon, the State Department was a monolith on how to fight the war. But it will reveal once I explain this which side won out if there were two sides. Okay. So you do not train 5 brigades a year for 8 years, right? As an insurgent Afghan type of army, right? You're that like they were trained to work seamlessly with other NATO forces, right? You do not build trench networks, right, for an insurgent Afghan army. Like what insurgency is this? Like there Russia has to deal with terrorist attacks in the new territories all the time. In Crimea this week, 3 people were arrested. In Russia itself, there was they didn't succeed. There was another failure in Russia proper in the north, where a Ukrainian woman, a very young Ukrainian woman, like 25 years of age, was arrested. Right. So this kind of stuff always goes on, but it isn't big enough or widespread enough to like really cause the kind of color revolution um, that America wants. So my gut feeling is the Americans always knew that Russia did not have a significant force to take over Ukraine, and that showed that Russia had no intentions over taking the entire country. There are several reasons. The SMO cannot be, I think, 300,000 people. Um, so they went in with under 200,000. That shows unwillingness to call for mobilization of reserves. Uh, so I think they were pretty confident that this was always going to be that kind of a war. So yes, I don't buy the idea that this was supposed to be some kind of Afghan 2.0 for the Russians, because the preparation for training of the units was not that kind of a warfare, right? Like, why would you like? I have never seen a country with so many trenches, since World War One. Virtually every wooded area of every farm field all over eastern Ukraine has trenches and mines. That's not an insurgent army to make people's lives really uncomfortable. Um, and if the pain just goes on long enough, Russians are going to rebel and all that kind of stuff. Maybe it was. That's just my opinion. Why waste all those years training them to fight a different kind of war?
Oh, I
Um,
completely agree that the idea of Ukrainians being Afghan insurgents was a complete fantasy from the beginning. Because the kind of training they have received since 2014 was with the understanding, now optimistically, it was with the understanding that these troops will push into the Donbass and hopefully
yeah,
Crimea and retake them and knock a blow and deal a blow to Russia that way. But
yes,
what
yes, the
turned out
humiliation, and they began shelling the Donbass in late January, early February, in order to provoke this response.
exactly, they wanted to bait a Russian response, which they successfully did. Now, I'm not saying that Russia did this on a whim. This was a long time in the making, and this was finally because when it comes to the shelling of the Donbass, there were several opportunities that could have led to Russian intervention. So, according to the people in the Kremlin and the Russian establishment, the time was right for that, or it was the best it's ever been, even if it wasn't necessarily ideal. So, we did see this. And given their training, given their equipment, they thought they could have the Russian army drive in and essentially what is run into a brick wall over and over until they wear themselves out. Now,
Mm.
that didn't happen. There were some parts where it stalled out, and there's some parts in the country today even where it stalled out. But ultimately, they, from the beginning, Ukrainian forces were training for what I can only describe as a World War One style war, just even judging on the trench works. They were prepared for
Yeah.
a full scale conventional war where they dig in and have the Russians exhaust themselves. And that seemingly still is the strategy between digging in and counteroffensive, which is what the entire. I know that's painting with very broad brushstrokes, but that's how the Ukrainians have conducted this war effort so far. And they are slowly but surely losing territory, and I think they anticipated that, but it's just in the hopes that the Russians will wear themselves out first. The only
Hmm.
problem is the Russians aren't showing any signs of tiring or demoralization, which brings back the question of long range weapons given to the Ukrainians and weapons with the ability to strike into the heart of Russia, because those are a double edged sword. Because I think they are, strangely enough, the only thing that could demoralize the Russian population, that could turn them sour in this war, is when they start having Ukrainian missiles land that far into the Russian heartland. But that also, I would say, even more likely has the chance of triggering the opposite response of more support for the Russian war effort, that Ukrainian missiles are falling onto the land because NATO provided Ukrainian missiles are striking into their heartland, because this has been what the Russian propaganda machine has been telling their people since the Maidan, since the
Hmm.
annexation of Crimea, that the West started this color revolution in Ukraine because they want to use it as a launching pad to ultimately destroy Russia. And I think that's a completely fair assessment. Propaganda doesn't necessarily have to be false, just a media that pushes a message. But I do think that message is largely accurate, and that the Russian people can reasonably fear that to be the case. And as Ukraine is provided with those long range weapons, I think they were the Storm something missiles that the British have
Yeah.
given the
Storm Shadow.
yeah, the Storm Shadow missiles that have the ability to strike that far. And then we saw the debacle with the drone attacks on the Kremlin and how those went. That what was initially a at least portrayed as a defensive war on Ukraine's part, has the very real possibility, and has at a few points shown to be something that crosses into Russian territory. And I do think that the Russian government does bear quite a bit of responsibility for allowing these incursions into Russia proper, even beyond the annexed territories, because you expect there to be these kind of issues in newly annexed territory on the front lines. But
Hmm.
when they start pushing into Bryansk, as we saw with that one attack, and other parts along the border, that's probably the biggest thing that caused them to question the legitimacy of the Russian government. But I don't think people look at that and think Putin has to go, that whoever else has to
No.
go. They just demand more of them, because ultimately, and look, I mean, the masses aren't intelligent by any means, but I think that whether we're talking about Russia or really any other country that would find themselves in the state, they are intelligent enough to understand that they can't afford to undergo a rapid change in leadership in the time of a war. And that's even
Hmm.
more true on the Ukrainian part. That's the only reason why Zelensky is still there today, because even the most hardliners understand that taking him out, even to replace it with their guy, would be a massive power vacuum that the Russians would capitalize on. And I think that the Russian people understand that just as well. And even going into the U.S., it's where pretty much every war the U.S. has fought, especially in the past century, has had little to no impact on the homeland. Even people here, when you look at election years, when there is active combat going on, pretty solid re-elections, whether that be World War II or Vietnam or the. Now, Vietnam maybe is a little bit of an outlier, or more recently the Iraq War with Bush winning re-election pretty handily. People don't like to change the status quo, even if it isn't the ideal situation, when they are in these situations that require at least the appearance of continuity of government, and in some cases the actual continuity of government. So what we have here is Ukraine's best last ditch effort is also, on the other hand, the worst thing they could do in terms of escalating this war and making it worse for them.
Right, and a lot of these attacks they are like media driven. They have to keep the morale of their soldiers and their society high. Um, I think in many ways the attacks on the Lavras in Kiev. I just saw a video today of a middle-aged guy slapping and trying to hurt a monk. Um, I saw another video of a guy that served on the front, and now as far as I know, there's no reason for him to get into like they were not arguing about Russia or the way the war is going, but the guy just lashed out, and there was a guy who was a vet in the comments who said, you know, vets when they come back, just seeing people go about their lives and generally happy can trigger them because nobody understands the reality that they just lived, right? So you're seeing these kind of fissures, these cracks beginning. Um, they're going to look for scapegoats. I know these are old scapegoats in Ukraine, but they'll look for more of them. I think the more unconfident they feel, and I think it has to be mentioned that Zelensky did say that Bakhmut was absolutely crucial. That after Bakhmut, there would be, if they lose it, because he reiterated that they would not lose it, and that it would be a shock to their morale if they lose it. Because then there's only one line of defense. Now that line is a thick line, right? Slavyansk is bigger than Bakhmut, and it has another little town next to it that's not little, called Kramatorsk, and then Konstantinovka, which forms a kind of a crescent on the west side of Bakhmut. But behind that is generally nothing. The next big city is right on the Dnieper River, and there's nothing in between them except farm fields and tiny villages. But yes, to return to, now these Storm Shadow missiles were used at least twice in Lugansk. I don't know if it was an oil depot or some kind of a place that made celluloid or something, but it got blown up. There was a Lugansk official that was injured because there was shortly thereafter a terrorist attack at a hair salon or some, yeah, it was a hair salon, but I think it's like, I guess, a unisex one. I'm trying to figure out why this Lugansk official was there. Uh, he was injured, but not dead, and in very stable condition. Fortunately, no one was killed. But yeah, like they have to look spectacular, right? Like if you watch Sky News, any of the Western news sources, right? If you were watching that as the Ukrainians were taking the crumple zones, and I'm not slagging them, like they took over a lot and they caused a panic that, like, frankly, Prigozhin is not to blame for. Um, if if um, if the Russians had listened to like General Lapin, who was in charge of the northern flank around Kharkov, uh, to begin mobilization in June, right? A lot of this would not have happened, or might have been rectified sooner. In any case, that didn't happen, and so the Russians got themselves in a situation where their men had fulfilled their 6 months, and now they had this enormous front with like less men than they went in. That's not the situation now. So yeah, going forward, like the other thing I guess we should talk about that may be related to missile systems that the West has given Ukraine is the shooting down of 4 Russian aircraft, 2 Mi-8s, one Su-34, and one Su-35. Now, even this to this day, the Russians are really focusing on bombing the Sumy region and the Chernigov region. I don't know why, but it's been going on for over 7 weeks now. They're they're up to something. I don't know what they want to do with this region. Moreover, they have also sent tactical forces into this region to take out as revenge for Ukrainian units, as revenge for the downing of these four aircraft. 9 servicemen died. And it was apparent they were apparently hit with NASAMS. These are missiles that like they don't have a beacon right at the beginning and they don't turn it on until later. And what I've read, the reason they got taken out is because they got too comfortable, and they flew the same patterns, bombing this place over and over again. And the Ukrainians this time were waiting for them, and they got them. And the procedure basically is the Su-34 drops the bombs. The Mi-8 helicopters cause some kind of interference with air defense radar, and the Su-35 is there to protect these units in case, particularly the Su-34 when it's bombing. Um, but it didn't work, and maybe the NASAMS are something serious. I don't know. Maybe that will change Russia's strategy. So far in East Ukraine, it hasn't, because there was a huge explosion in Avdiivka where a Fab 500 was dropped. The Russians have made new gains around Avdiivka, and it's Avdiivka is more closely to being completely enclosed than Bakhmut was. So this could be like another territory that falls sometime in the near future.
I would not be surprised given the trajectory of it, and I doubt that the Ukrainians are going to, unless there's some sort of relief effort, which you could say that the recent Ukrainian moves we saw in Bakhmut before the fall that we saw today
Mhm.
was something of a relief effort to get out as many troops as they can. So unless you see that for somewhere like Avdiivka or any of these other fronts, the front is probably going to stay stagnant with the Russians slowly chipping away at it, unless the Ukrainians have some sort of great retreat plan, in which case they fall back wherever and completely re-entrench along. I mean, at this point, I don't know in terms
Yeah,
of the layout of the land. I'm no general here, and I don't know.
yeah.
Perhaps I'd be a better one given the course of this war. But in all seriousness, here, really the best thing they can do is fall back, find a new place to entrench, bring up some troops from the rear. As we've seen, they've been bringing in more of the Western Ukrainian troops, more of the troops that they've sent to the west to train,
Mhm.
the more skilled ones, and then try to broker some sort of ceasefire, some sort of uh, stopping of the fighting in order to regroup the resources. And that's also combined with Biden signaling support for sending quote unquote more advanced jets. By that they mean F-16s to Ukraine, and
Mhm.
France, Denmark, and the Netherlands announcing a joint program that they're going to be sending over instructors to train Ukrainian pilots. Now, and have Ukrainian pilots also come to the West in order to train with Western instructors. But it does make me wonder, how do they really realistically plan on training,
Mhm.
pretty much rebuilding the Ukrainian Air Force from scratch up to go up against the Russian Air Force at this point? It is a pipe dream. The only way it could even possibly make sense, at least with the way I'm looking at it right now, is that they're preparing them for a reemergence of this conflict. After this conflict reaches ceasefire, whether it be several months, a year, however long it might be, that these men will be ready to confront the Russians and put up far more of a resistance against the Russians upon the regroupment of that. But
Mhm.
otherwise, I can't really see this being, whether that be Biden's announcement about sending more quote unquote advanced jets, about sending the F-16s, or the coalition of NATO countries that has agreed to train Ukrainian pilots. Other than that being some sort of morale booster that Ukraine is getting the weapons and the operators it needs to turn the tide of this war, even though time is not on their side when it comes to that. Now, as we've seen, and I think this war has done a great job proving that even with all the advanced weaponry in the world, when it comes to a real conventional war, infantry and combined arms are still the backbone of it. Of course, you want the air support, of course, you want everything else, but the backbone of it are going to be your infantry forces supported by your artillery and your other fire. But, I mean, even they don't get that much training. So, I doubt, even with the Western sponsors, and the Western sponsors also looking at this war, they're going to put that great of effort into training pilots at this point in a country with its air force that really needs to be built from square one.
Yeah, I mean, we said back in March that when talk was also at a fever pitch for the F-16s and the new, um, the new tanks and the new armored personnel carriers that were being promised to Ukraine, we were saying that maybe a lot of this stuff won't be used for a counteroffensive. I'm not saying it will or won't, but like we hypothesized that, especially with regard to the planes and possibly, a greater number of sophisticated tanks, they would want that after a kind of ceasefire is made, right? Because like one of the things I think that has surprised the West, right, is the longer that this war has gone on, the more it's depleted their own supplies. And this goes back to the possible the possibly different views of how to prosecute a war with Russia and China. And that is, if we waste all our materiel in a war in Ukraine, what will we have left for China? Like, what kind of military depth will we have? And so I don't think that, I think they thought like Russia would fold very quickly last year because of the sanctions, because of the kind of cultural hatred that was spun, and you'll never travel to Europe again and all that kind of thing. And the fact is a lot of Russians don't travel to Europe anyhow. um so I think the doctrine of how to deal with uh rising powers has been a challenge for the US. And you do get the sense that they would like to leave this problem to the Europeans to handle while they focus on China.
Trump himself has outright said that.
Right. So like, but the Europeans are experiencing enormous inflation right now, particularly Britain, right? No matter how bellicose Britain may be, Britain is in no shape. And I mean, even Ben Wallace has said that he definitely wants a job as NATO commander. Well, not commander, but NATO president. He wants to replace Jens Stoltenberg, I
Yeah.
guess. Um, he is saying that there will have to be military spending cutbacks. Like, it doesn't make sense, right? Send more, but also reduce the amount of spending. There's something there that doesn't jive, right? The other thing I just wanted to briefly go back to is, um, when those four Russian aircraft were knocked down, that same week, the Ukrainians lost at least seven. And I have not seen the Russians lose that much aircraft since, like, I don't know, March or February 2022. Like, honestly, months had gone by where they hadn't lost anything. And that was a big surprise. But it seems like the Russians still aren't that phased by it. So the Russians have also claimed that they have knocked down at least two or three Storm Shadow missiles. But if you want, we can get into some of the other stories in Ukraine on the battlefield that have happened since the last show because they're pretty spectacular in their own right.
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you want to go into more of the minutia minute, then by
Yeah.
all means, or the Kinjal Patriot showdown
Yes.
as well, because the narratives going around that were entertaining to say the least.
Yeah, because I mean, so in May, we are 20 days in May. Of those 20, 11 times Kiev has been bombed. This is the most we've seen since the first weeks of the war in 2022. So there is a very concerted effort. Um, there was a Ukrainian defense minister who said that the Russians have now changed tactics. They are targeting command centers. They're targeting centers for accumulation of troops. Um, they're targeting bridges. For instance, as the Russians were retreating south of Ivanovskaya, they took out one of the bridges across the canal that they formerly occupied. Um, but let's start with the west and move south and then move east. So the biggest news on the battlefront are two towns that, well, one of them in particular, you know, people might not have even have heard of, and that's Ternopil. In fact, when the sirens went off, the shelters had been locked. They had forgotten to unlock the shelters. That's how long it had been since there were air raid sirens. So the big deal is the ammunition dump that were that was destroyed in Khmelnytsky, but also in Ternopil, because the day after the explosion in Khmelnytsky, and if anyone's seen the video, you can see there are two other columns of smoke before that huge, spectacular explosion. And the day after an explosion, I can't figure out what the scale is. It looks identical to the one in Khmelnytsky. So at first, people didn't say it, but as time went on, you started to hear rumors that one of the munitions that had been destroyed, and billions of dollars worth of munitions have been destroyed, but one of the munitions was possibly the depleted uranium shells for the British Challenger tanks. At first, I mean, it was just something nobody wanted to think had happened. But a day or two later, the Ukrainian Ministry of Health um, said to residents that they should leave. Iodine was completely sold out in drugstores. A few days later, after that, Poland issued a, uh, an infographic, like a study that showed that a radiation cloud had formed. And then lastly, there was an article, I believe in Sputnik, by a British scientist studying radiation that, in fact, said these radiation clouds even made it as far as Britain after the war in Yugoslavia and the war in Iraq. So they can go quite the distance. Um, this cloud is moving, I think, now into Sweden and possibly Germany. So,
And I do have to give another recommendation to the wonderful Emil Kosman. Now, the man puts out, what, a dozen videos a day. And on this one in particular, I think he did a very good job. So I would check out his video
yeah.
on this Milnitsky radiation cloud. Now, there's perhaps it's wrong of me to take humor in such heavy subjects, but I can't help but laugh or smirk a little at the fact that this happened in Khmelnytsky, which, for those of you who aren't too familiar with some of the older history of the region, Khmelnytsky was the leader of the Cossack rebels against the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, whose action culminated in him personally, as well as the Cossacks, swearing allegiance to the Tsar of Russia. And the man who united the Ukrainian and Russian peoples has a province named after him in western Ukraine. When he was now the siege, as it were, did stretch across the Dnieper. That's undeniable. But as far as I know, he was born and lived most of his life much further to the east, which I do find humorous. And by any accounts, the people that he led, while there were some divergence in opinions, would have considered themselves part of the Rus, or just the general Eastern Slavic people, and didn't really see any difference between themselves and the Russians. Were defined by their orthodoxy, especially at the time when you had the cropping up of the Uniat Eastern Catholic churches, and in which case that was also a large part of the rebellion on top of that, and land rights for the Cossacks and peacetime versus wartime rights. It's a fascinating period if you haven't read up about it. And I'll admit I'm not the most well read in it, but there's a lot to dive into. It's one of, when it comes to being a history autist, one of my areas, and it's funny because I don't really have any connection to that part of the world beyond my good friend here, and even he's a Balkaner, but it's strange. I don't really have any real ancestral connection to this part of the world in any sense at all, but it's a fascinating subject that I can get lost in for hours, and I could probably do an entire show on it, and perhaps that will come one day, even though the amount of times I said about various topics in those shows that have yet to happen. But we're getting sidetracked here. But
Yeah.
I just do think it's funny that there is the Melnitsky province. But getting back to actual analysis of the situation between that and Ternopil, which are both in western Ukraine, I
Yeah.
mean it's undeniable that they hit depleted uranium rounds, which I mean I don't really think anyone can be surprised at. Perhaps there's an initial feeling of shock, but it's not. I mean, we've used them, that being the American Empire and its affiliated proxies, have used them in Iraq, Yugoslavia, Syria, pretty much every conflict we've had since Vietnam, at least. And of course, we had other tricks and
Yeah.
vile weapons we used in Vietnam, but still, and this isn't even. I mean, this isn't even some sort of moralizing point because I understand that. Look, harsh weapons are used in times of war. Just a couple things. Number one, is it necessary? Number two, what goal does it serve? Neither question which I can see a rational response to justify the drastic use of force. And then, I mean, it's not a shock that they're going to provide these to Ukraine to use against the Russians. And you can look up some of the effects of depleted uranium.
It's just the
Yes,
British being British. I
exactly.
mean,
It's the British being the loyal lapdogs of the American Empire.
not
Being
just that, they would do it on their own,
Oh
even
yeah,
if
no,
America
that's
wasn't
what
there,
uh,
because of
I
the
should
kind of hate
rephrase.
boner that they have for Russia for so many centuries.
I should rephrase.
Um,
It is them being the rabid lapdog of the American Empire, because of course their goals are completely in line with the American Empire, but then they have that historical rivalry and also the need to go above and beyond because they are a secondary power in a declining position. So they need to really show their teeth, show their fangs when it comes to these sort of things, so the world takes them at least a modicum seriously. Because since really the fall of the British Empire, they've been on a decline. I would say in these past few years, especially with the direction of their economy, it has been a marked decline to the point where the British are becoming an irrelevant force in the world, and they're doing everything they can to maintain that relevance, even if that means sending depleted uranium to Ukraine.
yeah, I mean, the reason depleted uranium is used because it's cheaper than using tungsten, right? Tungsten is basically as effective or almost as effective for piercing metal as uranium, but it is far less deadly. It does not have the kind of negative health issue impact on civilians. And it's ironic that the what has to be like a huge amount of those munitions are now gone. Of course, this is delaying the Ukrainian spring offensive, but it's also poisoning West Ukraine all over again. Of course, the magnitude is not the same thing as Chernobyl. Like, let's keep it in perspective. But that isn't to say that places like Serbia and Iraq don't experience children who are born with deformities. They do, as a direct result of using depleted uranium. So, um, yeah, I mean, that was huge news, and the Russians have really stepped up the amount of missile attacks all throughout May that we haven't seen for a while. Um, it could be that they want to attrition as much of Ukrainian forces or fighting capabilities so that Ukraine is not able to mount an offensive. Um, the other big story out of Ukraine right now is what has happened to Zelensky. Zelensky, by the time this program airs tomorrow, which is Sunday, May 21st, um, Zelensky will have been missing for 10, 11 days. And he did not attend the important NATO meeting. As commander of the Ukrainian military, he was expected to be there. The excuse was he was at a wedding, um, and couldn't. And then it was he was very busy. If people remember, there was another place that had a huge explosion that was suspected to be filled with munitions, and that was Pavlograd, uh, south of Kharkov, near Poltava. And some people suspect that Zelensky was there. There are rumors that Zelensky is in a Kiev hospital right now in critical condition. Uh, Again, no one has seen him in 10 days. He misses a NATO meeting. Like, surely Sirski, the guy below him who's in charge of Bakhmut, can mind the place. But if even he has not been very visible, although I think he was spotted 2 days ago. There was an attack on Chasov Yar when the Ukrainians managed their small tactical counteroffensive to crumple the flanks that the Russians had created north and south of Bakhmut. So it's interesting. We'll find out, I think, very shortly what has happened to Zelensky. And then in a kind of strange Prigozhin hermeneutic, Prigozhin said something like he directed a question to Zelensky and said, "Make sure you see that Zelensky is okay." Sounds like he knows something that the rest of us don't.
Make sure
He's such a
Zelensky is.
troll.
Uh, that's yeah.
Yeah, he's what a crazy guy.
I you gotta love it. There's really no two ways about it. But I I mean, look, we all saw him taking a nice little swim in Cyprus. I can't blame him. Look, given the opportunity, I would also take a swim in Cyprus and never return. As much as I love to do this program, as much as I love a lot of things about my life, I have to say some nice sandy beaches and nice weather. And look, if I lived on a nice island, I'd be a much happier person. I'm already a pretty happy person. I'm pretty content with the lot I have in life. Don't get me wrong, but also I'm not responsible for the defense of a nation in the largest war since World War II. But that's also aside the point. And these things keep happening. And who was it? Was that Aristovich who fled to Rome a few months
Yeah,
back?
yeah.
Uh, Probably actually coincided with my time there. Funny enough, but I don't know. Apparently, I did hear, and I know we haven't mentioned in a while, but Aristovich did have his weekly broadcast canceled by the Ukrainian state media. So at least for this week. So I guess we're not going to hear anything from him. I really wanted to hear Aristovich's take on the fall of Bakhmut. I'm surprised the guy is still alive. I'm surprised he's not on Mirovets yet. It's actually remarkable that he's not. But we've had an Aristovich drought. I'll just put it that way. And there are a lot of things I would give up in order to just hear his takes again.
Yeah. He did go. No. I'm getting him mixed up with the other guy. Never mind. I thought I had an Arestovich story to tell you, but
I unironically hope that I know it's not going to happen, but I hope Ukraine does have elections next year, and I hope Aristovich is the next president of Ukraine.
He will literally be the most sophisticated president that Ukraine has ever had.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh, uh,
it's yeah, more or less. That's it's not a very high bar, but he will be, and I think Ukraine deserves President Arestovich. I think the world deserves a Ukraine with President Arestovich because there's no other way that this can really be resolved. But I'm reminiscing too much about the early days of this war and his very fantastical takes on it. But
I love how schizo he
oh
was.
yes, the amount of doomering that man had taken part in was
Yeah.
remarkable.
I love the New York Times article. Um, Prigozhin phoned Zaluzhny, or whoever picked up the phone for the Ministry of Defense, and said that he would give away Russian positions, you know, for Bakhmut or something. It was such a I've forgotten it. I tried to bring it up with my brother. He wouldn't have it. He goes, "This is so stupid. I'm not even going to like. I will not discuss this with you.
I'm not
It's
going to
so
dignify
ridiculous."
this with even my attention.
So I can't. Yeah, it was so dumb. But part of it is Prigozhin's fault because he he talks a lot of smack, and um the Western media capitalized on it, but I don't think he cares. I just don't think he does. It doesn't matter to him what Western media says or not. Um, he just continues trudging along, and he was there today with his with his men. The night before, he went like he's right there in that whole Citadel complex, and it might have been in the Domino area, which is right at the back. And they go into a house and it gets shelled. And he's asking like, "Where's the cameraman?" And he said, "We need a cameraman. I hope we didn't lose the cameraman. We need somebody to film this."
You know, yeah, just as a complete sidetrack, do you know what my favorite Arestovich moment was?
Yeah, tell me.
After we win the war, we're going to unite with the Russian and Belarusian armies and crush the toy armies of the West.
Yeah, that I know. That's the schizo I love. I remember that. And he always says it so calmly, incredibly calmly. You're an idiot to disagree with me. Look how calm I am. How can I be wrong? I'm too calm to be wrong.
You know who
Uh,
he's you know what he's like in that regard? He is the
mm.
anti-Zhirinovsky. Because Zhirinovsky
Yes,
was
yes.
was boisterous and emotive and passionate about everything. Arestovich, you're hard pressed to get any change in tone of voice out of him.
Hmm,
It,
hmm.
which makes it all the better. But getting back into more serious news, I hate to leave behind the Arestovich talk, but it must be done. So as of May 18th, the Pentagon has overvalued U.S. equipment it sent to Ukraine by about $3 billion, a Senate aide and defense official said on Thursday. An error that opens up the possibility for even more weapons to be sent to Kyiv, of course, as the media calls it, for its defense against Russian forces, according to Reuters. Now, do I believe that they overvalued it? Do I believe it was just an error in the ledgers? No. Is it that ridiculous of a claim? It's also not that ridiculous of a claim. But either way, whether it was just a mistake in the books or they're completely lying about it, it's just more justification to send more aid. So we have not seen the light at the end of this tunnel when it comes to sending aid to Ukraine. The West will continue to deplete its stockpiles. And going back to the possibility of a ceasefire, we have Europe completely defeating itself to revisit Ben Wallace's statements. The UK only has enough ammunition for 5 days if an actual war were to break out. And it really gets in this position where you're not seeing a revitalization of the war industry on the American part. And we're probably the only NATO country, barring maybe Turkey, which I mean, Turkey's the renegade of NATO. Who knows what they have? And once again, which is why and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Which is why color revolution in Turkey would be monumental when it comes to the direction of the war in Ukraine. But when it comes to the absolute blow that European industry has taken this past year, France or Germany or the UK or many of these countries aren't going to be able to crank up their war industry to support the ammunition and supply needs of the Ukrainians. They can barely maintain their domestic civilian industry at this point. And you're also not seeing out of the U.S. Perhaps as confrontation, as the possibility of confrontation with China grows as well, as tensions continue on the Korean Peninsula, and as the issue with Ukraine also continues, you will see a complete revitalization of the military industrial complex in the U.S., which would also be. I mean, I could see a scenario, and once again, I still support Trump as the bad optics candidate because that's where we're at right now. But I don't know, they let Trump in, they let him take the credit for the revitalization of the American military industrial complex and looking at the output and saying, look at how many beautiful jobs that brought. We're building weapons to support the troops and our allies. It's a great selling point for the guy. It would the Trump base would eat it up and actually would have a I'm not going to say a great but a significant impact on American lives in terms of jobs and prosperity because when it comes to these manufacturing jobs, once again, it's bringing back manufacturing for an industry that we know is not going to go out of business. So I could see the possibility that, especially if they do decide to go with the Trump 2.0 narrative, which I'm still on the fence about. I don't know whether they're going to try to stick it through with Biden and his cohorts or try to give us the revitalized Trump. But, I mean, honestly, for either of them, revamping the American war industry insofar as it's even possible now is a really good sell and could bring a temporary boon to the American population, pacify them, put a little more money in their pockets, and also project an image of strength both at home and abroad. So I actually do see, it, especially if they can secure a ceasefire, which I think is the $1 million question here, that American war industry is going to be at levels we have not seen in decades in the next few years here.
Yeah. It. I mean, the military is a big segment of America's industrial power. I think what this war has shown is that it's lacking, right? Which is again to circle back to what you had said, which is why they will probably want to freeze this conflict, and it's just as likely that they would want to freeze this conflict after a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive. I think that's why guys like Sullivan and Blinken, more Blinken than Sullivan, keep pushing the Ukrainians to commit to this because let's just say it moves the border back somewhere um, close to the Sea of Azov in the Zaporozhye region, right? If they create a demilitarized zone, that's going to, eat away into territory that the Ukrainians theoretically would not have taken, and it would leave Russia very vulnerable. This is why even just a slightly effective one, the rationale goes, would work out. But of course, you would have to convince the Russians that this was in their interest, right? And that, you wouldn't, the Americans would no way restart a war again, which I doubt.
Yes, I would agree. And the sell they have to make is that this war is too painful to continue, or you can't afford to continue it. You're suffering from the same problems we are. And look, you can point to some problems in Russian industry and logistics, but I don't think that's enough of a selling point to see any sort of support, even among the Russian political class, for any kind of ceasefire. And that, I mean, or they could go in the other direction. They could really try to sweeten the pot. They'll say, we'll recognize this, this, and this. We'll give you this, this, and this, so long as you give us that. But I think they would also know that unless this Ukraine conflict is solved and negotiated on their terms, it's going to be a decades, if not century long problem for them. So I,
Um,
but really, what choice does the West have at this point, unless they're completely willing to flip over to war economy and send everything they have to Ukraine on top of convincing, I don't know, the Poles or whoever else to directly intervene.
mhm, mhm. And I think now it could be argued because the other big news about them going in, right? Um, if the polls, were to go in, uh, let's say the Americans and NATO secretly are aware of the limitations of the Patriot air defense system, right? Now, NATO has a lot of these, America has a lot of these. There's no way Poland could go in without them, right? But the one of the attacks that happened this week in Kiev, and the Russians are adamant about this, is that several Patriot missile systems or launchers were destroyed. So I don't know if people know, but like a lot of launchers give you at least 180 or 360 degrees coverage. I love what my brother said about this. The Americans only give you a third. So if you buy three, you got a full circle.
That's you see, that's actually how the Iron Dome works. And here's the
Is
thing.
it no?
No, here's the thing. I'm gonna explain the success of the Iron Dome here. So you only get a third. You need three to make a circle. But the Jews are so good at haggling, they get three for the price of one.
So yeah, how are they going to go in, right? Because they're going to feel a lot more exposed without like a really good system. I don't know. That's just one of the things that they'll have to consider. Of course, the Washington Street Journal, like, I mean, they kind of already are there. The Washington Street Journal had a British officer as a source who said that the SAS and SRR regiments are already in Ukraine and have been there since the beginning, and they work in both sabotage and attacking regular Russian formations. Strictly, it's advisory, but like up in the front lines and so on. So they already are there. The thing is like how comfortable are their societies to up the ante, right? Like if there was um, a major counteroffensive, I think they would like to go for the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. I'm assuming that's one of the reasons why the SAS is in Ukraine. And I'm pretty sure it's those guys who took out the Moskva battleship or cruiser or whatever it was. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that sounds about right. So that's all I had for Ukraine. Unless you have any last minute things where.
Yeah, I think that about covers it. There was an attack in Bryansk. I told you about the Russian like paramilitary units or some special forces went in and they killed inside Ukraine 11 guys. There were some horrific photos that were preparing a sabotage again in the Bryansk region, right? And that is like one of the things in the Seymour Hersh article that Zelensky wants to attack much further into Russia, and he has to be kept back, right? Just like those damn Europeans, they're crazy. Okay, Europeans, will give you the F-16s, fine. Just okay, use the long-range missile. Stop twisting my arm. Yeah, like it's there to create the illusion of independence, right? Anyways, the only thing I have just to end off the whole thing with Ukraine, and it just bolsters your point about a possible freeze of the conflict, and that is an 8-hour interview with Henry Kissinger in The Economist. Political also ran a story on this, and his reasoning is hilarious to me. At the moment, the most powerful army in Europe is Ukraine, obviously. Russia is nearly defeated, but Ukraine has no experience. No experience.
I also like how a
Politically
year ago he was
speaking,
talking about how Ukraine might have to make
yeah,
concessions.
I I know. For God's sakes, get a peace deal. Stop it. I can't watch anymore. And this was like
And he
a
was
month
also the same
after.
guy telling Trump to. In 2016, he said, "Oh, it's actually a good idea that Trump wants to reconcile with Russia to confront China." And then in 2020, he's saying, "Well, I'm advising Trump to go easy on China."
Yeah,
Well,
it's
it's
just
funny because I'm not going to downplay how intelligent and effective Kissinger's strategies have been for decades. I mean, you have to give him that very much. But it does seem as
mhm.
he gets older, the more he flip flops. It doesn't seem that he wants to commit to one position.
He's been warned. He's been warned. He did not stick to the narrative. I'm telling you. Somebody pulled him aside and says you can't say shit like this. I think that's all it comes down to.
Yeah, I mean,
I think he's scared.
how how out of line do you have to go to be reprimanded as Henry Kissinger? Is what I have to know. How sacrosanct does an issue have to be where you, as Henry Kissinger, the authority on American foreign policy, cannot say it? I guess it's
Hmm.
Ukraine needs to concede territory. I guess that is the sacrosanct line when it comes to American foreign policy, to the point where, because once again, and I said this back when it happened before he was reprimanded for it, Henry Kissinger can say anything. They will send him out to say the harsh truths. But apparently, there are some things that even he can't say, which does make you
Yeah,
ask a lot of questions.
yeah. Like he's basically saying Ukraine has no experience on the international diplomatic level. They don't have this class. They're like just this brute force with the most incredible military in the world. And again, it's the Arestovich line. We can't let the Russians have that. So we better put them in NATO. Like he doesn't say it, but he's implying that they could be turned against us. He is implying that. He doesn't directly say it, but he implies like, now would be the time to put them in NATO. Like, screw all the regulations and protocols that we've observed with every other member. This is a special situation. We got to get them in there. So, they're looking for a way to stabilize Ukraine somehow. I mean, he's basically saying we have to govern Ukraine because they just don't have a competent political staff, which he calls inexperienced, but it would mean like greater U.S. control. Um, of their political system. I mean, Ukraine, of course, would completely fall apart if funding stopped. Everything would be over. The army, the economy, everything would grind to a halt.
Oh, and I mean Viktor Orban I think put it best that Ukraine is an insolvent country and that without Western aid it effectively no longer exists. And that is the truth. There
Hmm.
is no longer a Ukraine beyond the billions of dollars in aid packages that come from the US and the European Union.
Yeah,
And that's not going to change. What Ukraine looks like after this war, that no possibility is good that Ukraine has, even if they do manage to dislodge Russia. Let's say worst case scenario for the Russians, dislodge from the Donbass, Crimea is at risk. Let's even say they lose Crimea without using the nukes, just to play devil's advocate, make the best argument you can. Ukraine is still wrecked as a country. It even in its victory, it will have nothing left to celebrate because what's what's left? The IMF owns the entirety of Ukrainian land. They get into the European Union so that people can mass exodus. I don't know. Maybe once again, maybe the second Israel theory is right. I don't want to believe it, but with how much Ukraine is being hollowed out, with the support of the Ashkenazi political class, seemingly within the United States, you can't help but ask some questions on it. Like I'm saying, I'm not
yeah,
saying I buy into it. By no means. And I'm not just saying that for the sake of the show. I don't buy into that. But if somebody were less informed on the issues and just seeing things here and there, I could see how one could be easily convinced that this might be the case.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Like I said,
But I think even for them, it's too dangerous
yeah,
right now.
it's
So
honestly too brazen, and frankly, I don't see them setting. I mean, look, setting up Israel number one, surrounded by the Arab world, was already a foolish move, as it were. But I honestly do think that setting up Israel number two in the former Pale of the Settlement seems like an even dumber move. Imagine they
yeah.
voluntarily go back to the Pale of Settlement. You cannot make. I mean,
I know,
the amount
I
of
know.
problems that would
What
have
a
been
three.
solved if they simply just stayed there. But here we are. I almost honestly I almost hope it happens at that point. I hope the Russians get control of it like they got control of the Ukrainian lands in Poland, so we can put them back. Okay, I'm not going to say it again because I feel like I'm really pushing the envelope on this. But I honestly, look. I'll be this brazen. I don't think the YouTube Jannies are honestly smart enough to know what the Pale of Settlement is, so I think I'm safe. But I digress. If you have any further Ukrainian news before I get into some of the tangentially related Russian stories and some European news before we get into both the Arab
No,
League summit and
those are all the major
okay,
news, the major news items from Ukraine at the
okay,
moment.
and
We
saying
we might have missed one or two, but those are I think we covered all the major ones. Oh, the only thing is the Russians have crossed over the Oskol River around Kupiansk, something that they hadn't done for since like last year.
hmm,
So there's a small movement in the northern area.
okay, that's it's probably going to be much bigger news on the coming shows. But just to give, we're about the halfway point of this show. I'm just going to give you an outline of where we're going to go from here. So I'm going to cover a little bit of stuff out of Russia in particular and some of the moves they've made globally, a little bit of Europe, but I'm going to focus the rest of the show on both the Turkish elections and the Arab League summit with both Assad and Zelensky's arrival. So, just to clean up some of the news out of Russia, Putin himself has said the oil situation is stable. There has been some instances of rail sabotage in Simferopol, which is part of a larger trend of sabotage and dysfunction on the home front in Russia. And I believe it was actually you did have the aircraft sabotaged on the ground that were taking off from Crimea. We discussed that back in October, I think it was. So there are still a number of problems with that. The grain deal is still being disputed. There are actually some hopes of a breakthrough right now, but especially with the, let's just say, transition phase in Turkey, that's going to be a very difficult thing to maneuver. Uh, Mishustin, the current prime minister, is scheduled to visit Beijing next week, and Russia, in a bold move, has also banned Greenpeace, which I can only imagine has and will expand to the other NGOs because that does seem to be once again one of the main vectors of the influence of the American empire is through the NGOs. I'm surprised Greenpeace didn't voluntarily leave as it was at the outbreak of the war, but it's one of those organizations that had to be dislodged by a ban. And also tangentially related to Russia is that RussiaGate was once again in more documents admitted by the people who were pushing it that there was nothing to this. Which, of course, abiding by the YouTube terms of service, I accept that every election in American history has been 100% above board and legitimate. So I'm glad that these sort of conspiracy theories have been put down and have been disputed. So that's always good to see. But it was one of the more absurd media narratives. And I do think that, frankly, it deserves its own autopsy. Maybe we can, once again, one of the many empty promises I'm going to make, try to do a show on that at some point because I do think that it's been something that has been overarching narrative that has not only affected a great deal of domestic politics, but also foreign affairs. And now, how successful those attempts would have been, even in the absence of Russiagate, is also highly questionable. But a lot of Trump's stated foreign policy goals were sabotaged by that hanging over his head for
Hmm.
pretty much his entire presidency. So I do think that it it is required that we ask some further questions about that, but I won't bog us down with that right now. I'll just get into some of the more minute European news. So, EU elections are scheduled to take place from June 6th to June 9th of 2024. Not that I think we'll see any major shakeup, but a lot can happen in a year, especially the direction of the Ukraine war. And the direction that Europe goes, I know Europe is still heavily under the thumb of the American Empire, but it will be interesting to see at least what the people reflect at the ballot box in terms of their satisfaction with the direction of Europe, because it's one of those times we could see a major right wing resurgence in Europe. Now, what will those right wingers look like? Will they look like the Gladio nationalists we see in several countries? I think Poland is probably the best one, but increasingly Italy, much as it pains me to say, is also starting to reflect that. Which brings me to my next story that the Italian government has blamed Wagner Group's activities in Africa and the Middle East for the waves of mass migration. So you are seeing this bone being thrown to the right wingers in Europe. Very minuscule. I mean, they'll take it away the first chance they get, and they will rapidly turn it against the right wingers once again once they get the opportunity. But trying to, and they've done it before, but they're trying to revitalize this narrative that Russian activity destabilizing the Middle East and Africa are the reason why you have to deal with these mass migration waves, and that if it simply weren't for the Russians, your governments would stop bringing in massive amounts of people from the outside world.
Yeah,
Which
it's
it is
ridiculous.
ridiculous. It is ridiculous, but a lot of people will take the bait. They'll eat it up hook, line, and sinker. They'll think, if only we could drive the Wagner Group out of the Central
Oh
African
yeah, everything would be
Republic,
peaceful.
everything would be peaceful. If only Russia left Syria, we would see a stop the influx of Syrian refugees. Even though since Russia has gotten involved, the number of refugees leaving Syria has decreased every year, and the amount of resettlement that has happened due to Russian both military and political efforts in Syria has been remarkable. I mean, look, I haven't been around that long, but in terms of conflicts in the past, I've never seen resettlement programs this successful. I'm not saying that they're successful by any
The,
means, but in
the only
terms,
country stopping resettlement in Syria is America because of their sanctions. They
oh
won't
yeah,
allow
exactly.
any heavy machinery or supplies to rebuild Syria. It's the only one. They're the only one. It's like, it's like that Simpsons skit where Homer he puts money into the pop machine and the bottle won't come down, so he puts his hand in it, and it's like look what the pop machine did to me. It's like, give me a break. It's you. It's like
Yeah, I mean,
it's like Europeans complaining about Putin using energy as a weapon. It's like you're the one who sanctioned his oil, like and gas. It's you. Like,
the
what are you crying
Russians
about?
the Russians had done nothing to you at that point. They had outstanding issues with Ukraine in terms of territory, and of course the sponsors of Ukraine, which just so happened to be the European Union. But the Russians would have been satisfied with a simple business relationship for the foreseeable future. So once again, the Europeans have, at the behest of the Americans, of course, have wedged themselves into this position, and now draw the sword and bring out resentment against Russia. I saw an interesting map a while back of what country do you think is the biggest threat to world peace, and of course you had America. It was a bit outdated. I imagine if you update it now, things would look different. America said Iran. Um, Israel said Iran. You had large swaths of Africa and the Middle East saying Israel, a few Americas spotted out there, a lot of East Asia saying either America or China, depending on which side of the divide they fell on. But all of Europe was Russia. And I had said at the time, and I still maintain this, perhaps the biggest evidence of Americanization of Europe is that all of the traditional ethnic and national rivalries have been supplanted by anti-Russian sentiments. So, there we have it. But it is one of those situations with that. And when it comes to that, I mean, I've back to the question of Syria. I've never seen resettlement efforts so successful. Looking at just let's look at the wars of the past 30 years in Africa and the Middle East that have had millions of people leave the countries. You haven't seen this kind of resettlement in places like Somalia and places like Ethiopia. Again, these people just haven't gone back, but due to the efforts of Russia and Syria, and now hopefully we're getting a breakthrough with Turkey. I know that's been a back and forth. It looks like that the actual Syrian refugees, the actual Syrian citizens who fled from their country, barring the unbearable situation that U.S. sanctions are creating, are actually being allowed to return home. As once again, many of them did, and we have to
Yeah.
remember that at the height of the refugee crisis, only about 30% of the people coming into Europe were confirmed to be from a war zone in Iraq or Syria. The rest of them were just ones who were either from the country in an area not affected or from other countries altogether trying to claim to be either Iraqi or Syrian. Which, I mean, that's not a surprise. These groups weasel their way into these kind of things all the time. But it is rich that the European Union, who otherwise would have supported mass migration, will blame it on the Wagner Group and the Russians in order to temporarily satiate the right wingers. The right wingers, being in such a downtrodden position, will take any bone that is thrown to them and run with the narrative.
Yes. So yeah, it's mighty rich that the Russians are responsible for all your demographic woes. It's not you guys. It's the Russians. No, it's because you're lapdogs, and because you will do anything that America and Israel tell you to do, and you'll pay the consequences. And the fact of the matter is, they're never serious about mass migration, anyways. Right? Just look at the Tories with their plan of sending illegal immigrants to I forget the name of the African country. Was it Uganda? And like, of course, that was never going to succeed. They were never
Kenya.
serious. They
Funny
were
enough,
just can't.
it was the. I'm not going to make the Obama joke. I am not going to make the Obama joke. It's the home of Malik Obama, half brother of former U.S. President Barack Obama. Also, I have to say, in terms of larger than life figures, Malik Obama is one of my favorites.
Yeah, very much. You got a feeling that him and Prigozhin would get along, but
Malik Obama, Kenyan ambassador to Russia, when? Not as an aside. Do you know how that how Malik Obama actually came to prominence?
no,
He
was it
was
during the campaign, the Trump campaign?
he yes, it was, but he was running for some sort of local office in Kenya. Asked Obama for an endorsement, didn't get a response, so decided to become a massive Trump shill. That's fun fact. That's actually how Malik
Yeah,
Obama
wow.
came into the spotlight. So, but that's aside the point. We're getting way sidetracked here. But
Yeah.
he's the superior Obama brother without question.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, they're not serious about this, right? I mean, the model that they're looking for is a model where nationalism can never rise, and the best way to prevent that from happening is by having a very diverse population and making the common denominator essentially, economics, economic issues, and having various ethnic groups, diverse ethnic groups, and divergent ethnic groups fighting amongst each other for the most. And of course, they always need a linchpin to succeed. The promises is that if you um, punish white people, you'll get more. And in a way, that is true. That it seems to be
Well,
working.
I, I,
So
I do think, and I will say this about a couple things when it comes to America's relationship to Europe. I think out of all the historical comparisons you could make, funny enough, the most fitting for the conduct of the American Empire you can say is the Ottoman Empire, whether that be at home or abroad, because it does have, and I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of it, but it does have the Malay systems where they have the castes of people who are usually defined by ethnicity and, at least in the case of the Ottoman Empire, religion, where you had that, there were your betters, you didn't cross your betters. Now, I'm not going to say the Ottoman Empire was less intrusive because that would be giving it too much credit, but there's no Jesus system in the American Empire. There's no tax you can pay for them to get off your back. It's you get taxed and you get hassled. I mean, that was also the case in a lot of the positions in the American Empire. Of course, you have the Janissary class, that being the LGBTQ CIA in the case of the American Empire. And honestly, I think America, a pretty apt description for it, is the sick man of the world. It is fitting in that regard. But in terms of the ethnic conflict in Europe, and I agree, they always want a wedge population that they can use there against the majority in order to enforce their will. Again, that's basic empire management. We've seen this time and time again.
Yeah,
But I've talked about this before, but I do think it bears repeating that the period from 1914 to 1945, from the beginning of World War One to the end of World War Two, saw some of the biggest and most aggressive ethnic cleansing campaigns we've seen anywhere in the world in history. There's a reason
yeah.
why, up until the migration crisis, in what, let's just say, even just being generous, starting about 10 years ago with the outbreak of the Syrian war into what it really was, 2013 is when things really took off, and when we started to get a lot of migrants pouring out of the country. 2013, 14, 15 into about 16, I would say, was the height, and then that was, of course, the issue with Brexit, Trump campaign. They talked a lot about migrants, refugees. That's getting off track here, but Europe's homogeneity was paid for with a lot of blood. And look, you could say that's justified, you can say that's unjustified. The point being is, it happened. People were expelled, people were resettled by the millions. You had something like 2, 3 million Germans after World War II resettled from all parts of Europe back into either East or West Germany, depending on where they might have been, whose occupation they might have been under. You had just recently, as the 1990s, the wars in Yugoslavia with the ethnic cleansings and the redrawing of borders there. Uh, and just in Central and Eastern Europe, when it came to the Hungarian populations and the breaking down of Hungary and the ethnic populations that came out of the fall of the Austrian Empire. Of course, even the situation in Western Ukraine with a lot of the Poles. I mean, there's a reason why Lvov has no real significant Polish population today. That was because of the Volyn massacres, which actually Polish Polish government officials have actually lodged a complaint against the Ukrainians for the Bandera worship and saying that, look, we want some sort of reconciliation, recognition of the Volyn massacre for what it was. So, I mean, I don't think that's that point of tension, even if it is significant, which I don't think it's that significant when it comes to a lot of the Polish population. I think a lot of them will just collectively erase that from their consciousness for the sake of the narrative. But even if that were,
For the moment,
yeah, for the
but
moment,
they do expect an official apology.
Of course, the Moscow hordes have to be dealt with first, but they do want to hear something about that sooner or later. But the American Empire will also do everything in their power to suppress that discussion, not to let it drive into a wedge. Even though I do have to admit, out of all the things that could potentially fray between Ukraine and the West, them and Poland disputing over those historical issues is probably one of the biggest ones. But I'm getting too far into the weeds here. Point being is, the homogeneity of European states that we saw up until relatively recently was paid for in the blood of millions. Whether that was right or wrong, whether it was justified or justified, whether the results were good or bad, irrelevant. Objectively speaking, it was a bloody process to get there, and now we're seeing, through the support of the American Empire, the European Union, and all the other affiliated associations, that they are willing to put these Europeans back in the situations they were before all of this, and really, in my opinion, whether or not it takes the form of, say, a right wing uprising or whatever else it might be, they're setting up for the same position for some sort of major change in Europe, whether that be in favor of the populations of Europe or the populations they're importing. But point being, no matter whose favor it's going to be in, they're gearing up for something that is also going to end in a lot of violence, a lot of bloodshed, and a lot of tragedy, frankly. And look, perhaps you don't think that people should be there, whatever. I agree that Europe does need to crack down on these things, but it's not going to be a fun, pretty, or easy process. And a lot of people who frankly don't deserve it on both sides are going to suffer because of this in one way or another, no matter what the result of this is. The point being is there is no clean or good solution to any of this.
Mm. Yes.
And I take look, it's not fun saying these things. I take no pride in saying these things. I know I don't necessarily act the most serious all the time on the show, but this is a real concern of mine that we will see significant amounts of violence on the European continent, even outside of the current war zone, because of the policies that the American empire and its affiliates have brought in to Europe, and that what has been one of the most peaceful times in its history. Look, there's been other problems of social, moral, and economic issues, don't get me wrong, but in terms of violence and loss of life, it's actually a pretty good time to be living in Europe right now, uh, despite everything else. But that is all set to be undone by the usual suspects, and I don't think anyone should be surprised by that. And of course, they don't give a damn about the effects they have on the civilian populations, and even as much as they agitate and give them political favors because they serve them, even if we're taking a purely humanitarian view, you really think they care about these migrants? You really think if it wasn't in their interest that they wouldn't send them, do what the British are doing and resettle them all to Kenya tomorrow? Of course they would. Of course they would. And there's no I hate to keep harping on the same point, but there's no clean, easy solution to any of this.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's just the situation has progressed to a certain point. I mean, I don't have one. I don't have a solution uh, because there's no political will either to change it. Um, you can see how no matter how poor the decision making and how costly its consequences are that the European elites make, um, it doesn't even matter how often they fail. If they adhere to this ideological purity of neoliberalism, right? They will be rewarded. They will never lose respect. Um, and again, it's perception management, right? The voice of the average person is subsided, subdued, repressed, uh, in order to keep up appearances. And frankly, like the population doesn't feel like it has the will or even the power to change things.
Yeah,
So
and those are the
I
ones
don't
who
know what
even
to say.
consciously recognize the problems, as it were.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're right. I mean, and I guess France also does warrant a lot of discussion. Maybe not necessarily in this episode, but just in general, where I think it was last September, September before that, somewhere within the past year and a half, you had that letter by the 20 retired military officers talking exactly about this situation, saying that unless there's a major course correction, this will come to a head, and this will cause a mass amount of violence and strife on the streets of our country if something is not changed and not changed very quickly. Even though I do think their assessment is one of those too little too late things, that the seeds have already been sown for this. But and that's the only amount of pushback I've seen, except the moderate electoral success of right wing parties. And I mean, hell, even going back to Italy, which is where this discussion started with the FDI government and Maloney. You have to remember that they also won on the anti-migration issues. There were other issues that they won on, some of their social policies, but that's not what's at stake here. That's not what we're discussing here.
Hmm.
But we've seen that migration into Italy has increased since Maloney's taken office, and I will say, just to be completely fair, that the NGOs do ramp up their activity under right wing governments as both a punishment and a demoralization tactic. Why even bother electing the right wing parties if migration goes up under them? Well, admittedly, the NGOs do go harder. But I also don't think that the current government in Rome is doing nearly enough, and I think Maloney has been a major disappointment to many people. Not, I mean, I was cautiously optimistic to my own detriment. I don't know why I allow these kind of things to happen, but I mean, best part about an Italian government, you don't like it, just wait 18 months. But when it comes to
Mhm.
this, it's it really comes down to that, where you have these so-called right-wing populist governments lecturing you on how it's actually Russia and their proxies who are causing the destabilization migration, when our governments are not lifting a finger to change anything about it. So once again, it's this trap that is going to be continuing to fall into. These are political cycles. Right-wing parties who are hardliners on the immigration questions are probably going to do very well in the polls and in elections in the near future, but it's ultimately going to be a cycle of them being impotent, either because they're put there as controlled opposition, or they simply don't have the tools to wield the power that they have been theoretically vested by these elections, until it eventually comes to that very unfortunate head, which I don't think is going to end cleanly. And I'm not saying this is some sort of American exceptionalist that I think everything's going to be fine on our little continent over here across the pond, because I think things are going to be just as bad, if not worse. I mean, look at the southern border right now and the situation brewing there, especially now that we've lifted a lot of the emergency restrictions that were put in place in 2020 that halted a lot of the migration. So things are going to come to a head. I am actually very concerned about what the American Southwest are going to look like, what a lot of the border states are going to look like within the next few months to a year here. It's probably going to be a huge thing in 2024, and you could see a hard right turn of a lot of the American population on the immigration question. The question is, and once again, will electoral politics be enough to solve that? And the question also is, with the American states, how are they going to react to that? So I'm not saying the situation in North America is looking to be a much brighter future, but it's troubling times ahead. And look, there's only so much analysis you can say, you can give before you just have to say that things are looking bleak.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a common sentiment now. People, I mean, even in places like at work, people don't want to. They don't want to deal with it. Like it's just bad news, you know. Like if I bring it up, it's what I'm saying.
yeah, and I mean,
Uh,
the American
People
population,
just become quiet.
the American population. I mean, it's not unique to us. I'm sure the Canadians and the Europeans can say a lot the same, but Western populations in general, just put it that way, biggest ostriches in the world. They're bury their heads in the sand. Except when they do bury their heads in the sand, whether that be any chosen form of entertainment, the propaganda is inescapable. Most of those as well, as I'm sure you. I don't need. I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you this. I'm sure you all know full well what's at hand here. But it, it's one of those difficult things that nobody wants to discuss, and perhaps I'm even too optimistic saying this. But if they are not discussed, they're going to be dealt with. And I'm not, of course, I'm not advocating any of this, but they're going to be dealt with far harsher methods than conversations in electoral politics. And look, I'm no believer in liberal values anymore at this point, but I that doesn't mean I want to see the destabilization chaos that is going to be caused upon these situations not even being
Mhm.
discussed. But I think I'm harping on this, so I'm going to round out some of the European news, and then we can get into some stuff about the Arab League in Turkey. So
Mhm.
Hungary, once again, the lone voice in Europe, managed to stall another arms shipment to Ukraine. So it's always good to hear. And the Chinese have also said that Hungary is their main target of investment in Europe, because, once again, one of the few rationally governed European countries, and they'll see a massive amount of benefit from this. I do think that, strangely enough, if Europe isn't talked completely into anti-China sanctions and completely kneecapping themselves like that, there is a great, let's just say, uh, off ramp for a lot of European economic woes. Not all of them, but a lot of them, if they do continue down the path of Chinese economic investment. I know what a lot of you might be thinking, and fair enough, debt traps, whatever. Well, point being is, when you're a smaller nation dealing with a larger nation economically, number one, debt traps are baked into the cake. they all come with strings attached. Whether you're dealing deals with the Chinese, the Americans, the Russians, the point being is who can cut you the best deal because you're going to have to give up something in this. That's just the way it is. And as it stands before, as I've said time and time again in my America China analysis, while you can talk about all these things that the Chinese do to countries that smaller countries that they do business with, which I'm sure many of them do have, and I'm sure a lot of it isn't just complete blatant lies. The question is, do people still see that as a preferable alternative to the strings attached that come with dealing with America? And I think at this point, judging by the amount of countries that trade with China and to a lesser extent Russia versus America and how the trends have changed over the past 20 years, people are more willing to deal with the consequences that may come from Chinese investment and influence in their country versus American. Now, maybe, I don't know, 10, 20 years down the road, that will have proven to be the wrong decision. But at this point, the Chinese are selling themselves much better than the Americans are, and that's just an objective fact, whether you agree or not. Whether you agree or not with what the Chinese are doing, I should say.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what more I could add to that.
you want to talk about this bizarre meeting with Zelensky and the Pope?
Yes.
So,
This was truly crazy.
you want to take the reins on this because I feel like I've been talking a lot. I feel like I've been snubbing you a little.
Sure. Well, so Zelensky, this is funny, right? Because he left Ukraine on the morning of the attack on the Kremlin with those two drones, and he ended up in Finland of all places. Finland, the new member of NATO. And I have to hand it off
Unfortunately,
to the guys in the
with Sana Marine not in office, very sad
yeah
day for
yeah
democracy. But continue, please.
yes. So um, and now he went to Germany after that, then France, and now I don't. And he ended up in Italy, and he visited the Pope in Rome. And he stressed how much he wanted a peace deal, like the Ukrainian peace deal, which means like Russia gives up all the territory, including Crimea, and they pay for all the damages, and then you have peace, right? But the craziest thing that he did is he presented to him uh, an icon constructed out of bulletproof vests that had been painted. And the image of the Christ child in Mary's arms is like blank. It just has an outline and it's a black void. I don't know what he means by this. The Pope, popes in earlier times would have rejected it and would have told him never to come here again. He also, of course, wore his stupid green sweats because, of course, he's at war, right? Assad can show up to the Arab League after 12 years, a war that's has been going on much longer, and he was much more in danger of his life. I mean, there were times where uh, um, ISIS and whatever other jihadis that the Americans, Arabs, or the Israelis were treating for their wounds were only 200 yards away from him, right?
Well, I'll put it this way: it would be less ridiculous if you would just wear a proper military uniform or proper fatigues than just this green sweater. Like,
Yeah,
at
it's
least
so old.
at least you'd be, I don't know, look it would look far more presentable. I'll just put it that way. But you make a good point that Assad has been far more in the line of fire, and he still manages to find time to get himself dressed up properly every day. But
Hmm.
going back to I'm not even going to call it an icon because the defacement of an icon, I should say, with his presentation of that to the Pope. I mean, I guess the point was like, oh, uh, this is supposed to represent the lost Ukrainian youth or blah blah blah, whatever. I mean, and it was strange because even though he accepted it, there was a great deal of pause. I mean, at least the way I read his face, a great deal of pause on the Pope's face when it came to even accepting it. Now, as you said in previous times, this would have been unthinkable. I mean, even just as far back as the most recent Pope. What was that? Benedict. Can't remember the what number in
Yeah, Pope
succession.
Benedict.
Yeah, I can't remember what was it, 15th? Am I thinking is that too high? But I that irrelevant. You guys get the point. Or even the beloved John Paul II. I mean, he wouldn't have accepted that, and it's really,
Hmm.
yeah, it was bizarre, and it's also strange because Francis has gotten a lot of criticism in terms of taking what, in my opinion, has been a rather neutral position towards this war, saying that, oh, yeah, Russian aggression bad, whatever. But have you considered that maybe this isn't a one sided affair and that perhaps the way this war is brought about, multiple parties are responsible? And yeah, he has, and I do think at some point he directly said that uh, the West has been provocative towards Russia. Once again, he's being the Pope of, well, once again, the largest Christian church in the world. A lot of course, people across Europe, it's still the plurality of religion of Europe. Now, how devout people are actually in practicing it varies from country to country, from place to place. But you look at the largest swaths of Catholic populations in the world, I think it's in South America, increasing in Africa, and in other parts of just the non Western world in general, is where Catholicism really gets its base now. And of course, these people, maybe they're not pro Russia, but they're not on the same anti Russia fervor that the West is necessarily. And even just thinking it from pure politics, you can't have the Pope coming out there and saying, well, and pretty much sounding like a neoconservative on the issue. Whereas in the past, especially during the times of the Soviet Union, you could have had that and would have been well received with Catholics. Whereas if you're a Catholic in somewhere in Africa or Latin America, and the the Pope is talking about the dangers of Russian aggression, you're not really going to care because you're so disconnected. You're so far removed from the issue. It's not really anything. So I do think a large part of what he, I mean, because look, like it or not, it is a political office in terms of when you're, I mean, religion and politics are so intertwined, despite what the secularists and the liberals would like to believe. I mean, even they don't believe that, but as much as they would purport to believe that, it's completely intertwined. So when you're head of a church, of a religious body, especially of the size of the Roman Catholic Church, your statements, a lot of them are going to carry political weight. So, I mean, look, like I said, all credit where credit is due for the relatively balanced position he's taken on this war. But this was just, I mean,
Hmm.
of course it's objectively wrong what Zelensky did. I don't think any genuine Christian could ever condone anything close to it. But it's not so much outrage. I feel is just bizarre. There's no really other word to put it.
Yeah. Now there was a Vatican publication where the journalist said, like, this was almost sacrilege. How could he offer something like this to the Pope? Um, like I say, popes some popes in the past would have completely refused this nonsense. So, but Zelensky was doing his level best to, gain some kind of support. But of course, a lot of people are saying that Zelensky doesn't even want to be in Kiev, probably because all the distractions of missiles landing in Russia. Um, none of the There's other distractions, but none of them can take away from the
Will
fact that
those
Ukraine is
be
going to
white
lose
and
Bakhmut.
grainy and powdery, perhaps? But I imagine you'd
Yeah,
find that
there is
elsewhere.
That rumor.
But
Yeah.
I
So
digress.
yeah, so he goes to Rome. He tries to get the empathy of the Pope and everything. I personally don't think the Pope is going to budge, and uh, he then comes back to Kiev for 2 3 days, and then he takes off. And I suppose this is a good segue to lead into like news in Asia and Saudi Arabia. So he was then wasn't then was going to the G7, but of course he went first to the Arab League Council, where Assad, after 12 years, has been invited back. Assad got a very warm greeting from Mohammed bin Salman. Um, he was treated very well. I didn't see like Zelensky treated. There might be videos, but I haven't seen them. Now, all the papers in the Middle East do not even show that Zelensky showed up. right? He's there somewhere in the text, but there are no images that Zelensky was at the meeting.
Yeah, no
Of course,
headlines, no images,
the
which is
the
really
this
all that matters.
right. Of course, Assad, his photos of Assad at the Arab League Council meeting were plastered across all sorts of front page newspapers all across the Middle East and especially in Saudi Arabia. But the craziest thing that Zelensky is if like offering this sacrilege of an icon to the Pope wasn't enough, he said he decided to lecture the Arabs about the fate of the poor Tartars of Crimea and how they're they are the persecuted Muslims of Ukraine. And like just let's just put this in historical context, okay? The Tartars, along with the Turks, had a lucrative slave trade of any Slavic people, particularly Slavic Orthodox people living in that area. The fact that the Russian Empire came, whooped them, took the land away from them forever is a blessing from God. Don't like shut the F up.
Oh yeah, and
It's
yeah,
over for you.
that's getting into
Like,
a lot of the local, and I know this is the case in the Caucasus, and it's also the case elsewhere. But when it comes to that, for example, the Georgians and the Armenians actually petitioned the Russians to liberate them from Muslim rule, and there were cases like this all over the place where not only the Russians but these populations living under their subjugation would petition the nearest Christian power to liberate them.
mhm, mhm.
But yeah, it's the audacity of Zelensky just going. Don't forget the Tartars, who, as you said, were
Yeah, yeah. He
uh,
says
one,
he, yeah.
once again these massive slave traders running raids on any, once again, Slavic Orthodox Christian they could get their hands on. The fact that that was stamped out completely, and look, as I've been told from liberal Whig history, that brutal wars to end slave trades are completely justified as shown by the American Civil War, so why wouldn't I support the Russian Empire in doing the exact same thing? Of course. Of course I would.
Mhm.
But, yeah, for him to just go down and say that. And realistically, when it comes to the Tartar populations in Russia today, what oppression do they face? In fact, you could argue, especially regionally and especially with the way the Russian Federation is structured, they're given a great deal of privileges for being part of the Russian Federation and a great deal of ethnic autonomy within
Yeah.
their individual territories within the Russian Federation. So it's rich, and look, perhaps you could realistically make the argument saying that perhaps the Russian Federation extends too many rights and privileges to these ethnic republics, and I'm not going to get into that, but just to see that point. But point being is, versus the amount of rights and privileges Ukraine cedes to the Russian population in its country, or the Hungarian population, or the Romanian population in its country, it's a night and day contrast. Like, come on.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like, yeah. Don't fall for it. There's a horrible history behind this. It's wonderful and a blessing from God that the Ottoman Empire collapsed. You know, and Russia played the most decisive role in that happening. Uh, so yeah, he can shove it.
He
So
can pound
he
sand.
didn't
There's plenty
convince
of it
anybody.
around.
Assad even took his earphone off. What's that?
I said he can go pound sand. There's plenty of it
So,
around.
so, yeah, he was he wasn't received well. Assad, for instance, took his earphone off because he didn't want to listen to him. Most of the faces were very stony in their countenance, and yeah, so after Saudi Arabia, he then flew to the G7 in Japan, and of course, begging for money. Biden promised another $375 million, which isn't a huge amount, but uh, it was kind of funny to see like the Japanese warmly greeting the guys that dropped two nuclear bombs on them. So, um, but the theory is he does not want to be in Ukraine right now.
Can you blame him?
Yeah.
And honestly, I think that does bring up questions. I know we were discussing this a little bit earlier. Perhaps within the halls of power, within the corridors of power, there may be some machinations against him. That's not an unrealistic thought. I can't name anyone in particular, or name any group. I mean, I can name some groups, but I can't name any particular plot that would be going on.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not unbelievable that there is a palace coup in the works against Zelensky, especially with how poorly the war has gone with the fall of Bakhmut. Understandable that he would want to be out of the country at a time like that when they may want to try to force him into some sort of concession, if not outright driving him out of office, whether that be by the, um, let's just say, more or less forceful means. Now, I'm
Mm-hmm,
not
mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that definitively, but I'm saying it's a real possibility that, given the intensity of the situation, that I mean his grasp on power is very fragile.
It is, and it's becoming more and more fragile. Yeah. Um, because of course, when disaster is on the horizon, right, scapegoats will be needed, and he's afraid of becoming a scapegoat, right? Um, so I mean, we'll see. It depends on like what Russia does next after taking Bakhmut.
Yes, and perhaps we've seen these kind of situations happen before in, let's just say, countries of much less consequence than Ukraine, where upon leaving the country on diplomatic business, the leader of said country will return to see that they have been ousted from power. So
Hmm.
I don't think that's going to happen here because I think the spotlight is too much on Ukraine. There's too much at stake for them to uh, depose Zelensky that way. But I look, I think it's foolish to assume that there isn't some sort of, let's just say, overthrow of him in the works. Now, what form that will take and whether it will even come to fruition are two separate questions entirely. And I still maintain that so long as he's breathing, he will be in power for the foreseeable future because both inside and outside of Ukraine, they cannot afford the instability or the optics of a what's functionally a regime change in Ukraine.
Hmm.
But going back to the Arab League with Assad's warm welcome, it was remarkable that the past 12 years of people who have been funding insurgents against Assad greeted him warmly. And look, I know that's just the way that relations between states goes. They can be at each other's throats, they can even be at war. And then within a decade, they've reconciled and they are shaking hands and having a warm summit. But he was received universally warmly. Everything I saw, there was no snubbing, there was no uncomfortable handshakes or photo ops. It was funny him being the only suit and tie there, with the other Arab leaders in much more traditional garb. That was entertaining to see. But I mean, I guess suit and tie beats showing up in your gym clothes like Zelensky did. I'm sorry, your bunker clothes. No disrespect to Mr. Zelensky, of course not. He's a personal hero of mine, as he should be. No, I'm too disgusted to even finish that joke. I'm sorry, but it does show, even with, and look, we'll talk about Turkey later, but even as negotiations with Turkey have stalled out and the political situation in Turkey is still very much up in the air, as we're going to go into a second round of Turkish elections within the next couple of weeks, we do have, on the other end, what is a complete reconciliation. I don't think there's any other way around it between the other Arab states in Syria, and that's also coupled with a reconciliation between the Arab states and Iran. I believe Assad also during this met with Sisi. I believe there was photos of that. Egypt was always an interesting case in terms of the Syrian civil war. They never really took a side, and perhaps that's what spared Sisi from the Assad curse. But and I don't know, perhaps that's what spurred on all this thing. They all picked up on the reality of the Assad curse, but I digress on that point as well. But that was a relatively warm meeting between Egypt, which is certainly one of the more significant Arab states, and also one of the states that isn't at complete odds with Israel as well. And I mean, Egypt on the Israel question is vital because if their foreign policy were to turn much more hostile towards Israel, things would change drastically. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but because I think the status quo generally serves Egypt's interests pretty well, I think they're doing insofar as how else they could be doing. That's one of the better scenarios Egypt has found itself in. Not the best, but one of the better ones. But there
Hmm.
was that. He met with, it escapes me, the leader of the United Arab Emirates as well. But it was warm welcome all around. And this may also negate some of the effects of the U.S. sanctions and the U.S. deprivation of resources in Syria because, of course, you've had the U.S. and their proxies occupying northeastern Syria, depriving it of wheat and oil, which has led to mass economic unrest in Syria to the point where the Russians and the Iranians have to ship in tankers of oil. Especially in the case of the Iranians, those tankers were subject to constant harassment by the Americans and their proxies. But now that we have what is, and I think Assad showing up at the Arab League really does settle it, a complete reconciliation, that opens up the markets of the rest of the Arab world to Syria, which, given everything else, has the potential to greatly, not entirely, but greatly mitigate the effects of U.S. sanctions and occupation in Syria when it comes to the economic standing there.
Right. They're going to be very interested in getting things resolved in Syria. There is a proposal, for instance, to create a railway. Talk about preparation for the near future. That extends from Syria across Iraq into Iran. The formalization of the railway from St. Petersburg to the Caspian Sea, and then from there to Iran to the Persian Gulf, has there was a meeting in Moscow recently to discuss that. So there's an integration process that's happening. Um, Iraq has said no more use of the American dollar, as has Venezuela. But for Iraq to do it, it's a very big deal. This is a serious neighbor. It still has an American military
A
base.
country that the Americans invested
Um,
how many trillions in gaining influence over? What, 2 trillion?
right. So
Three
there's
trillion at that point?
yeah,
What was the final bill on the
exactly.
Iraq War? I want to know.
I think it's like 2 billion, 2 trillion, right? Something like that.
Yeah, it was
Yeah, but America
it was
always
a
pays its
trillion with a
debts
T, and I think it
because
was
the
a,
money printing machine go burr.
and I think the combined cost between Iraq and Afghanistan was about 3 trillion, 3 trillion some decimal point.
Yeah,
But
yeah. I
but Iraq
remember
in particular,
three
I think,
trillion for
yeah,
Iraq and Afghanistan, for Afghanistan and Iraq. Hello?
yeah. But it was, yeah, it was something like that up there with the bill. But point being is, the amount of money the U.S. invests in uh, keeping the country under the American thumb only for it to ban the U.S. dollar is monumental. And considering the fact that although we have largely withdrawn, there still is significant American presence there. That's being overtaken gradually by Iranian and Iranian-backed influence. But and like I said, with the ending of the rival, well, maybe not complete ending, but with the what seems to be the beginning of the end of the rivalry of Saudi Arabia and Iran, violence and unrest across the region, including Iraq, especially Iraq, is probably going to dwindle. Now, Iraq still has the problem of the Kurdish population, and that will also be contingent on Turkey and how they respond and how the Iraqis feel about the Turks getting involved in their Kurdish situation. So that's probably the last big one. which makes Turkey, as I know I keep teasing it, we will discuss it in these next few minutes here, the real center of conflict and instability in terms of its relations with its neighbors in the Middle East. I mean, even Israel has been really. I mean, Israel's surrounded at this point. What are they going to do?
Right. But maybe one last country to look at in the broader picture, because I think what we're looking at is the Middle East integrating into a new system. And it's China, it's the yuan. Pakistan has now given up on the American dollar for transactions.
Oh yeah, that's
Imran
also
Khan,
on as they are negotiating a pipeline deal with the Iranians.
that's right, they are. The Americans are standing in the way, but they've retaliated. So I think I mean, the charges against Imran Khan in the first place were ridiculous, and I don't know which court said it was okay, but but the Supreme Court, which is probably no more. In any case, it's valid because, let's say, for Schmittian reasons, right, of who is the sovereign, they have said that he was illegally arrested. Now, um, initially, the authorities weren't going to let him go. There were protests over 12 different towns. Someone had put a video together of all the rioting and fighting with police. 8 people lost their lives. Um, his following is too strong. I mean, even if he's reinstated as president of Pakistan, it's a country with a lot of problems. But um, I think moving away from the American dollar is very significant because obviously, what we've talked about this is connecting the Mediterranean to to China vis-a-vis. It's part of the Silk Road. I mean, that's really what they're working towards. But I just wanted to throw that in before we move to discussing Turkey because the election is next week, and
Yes, and just
yeah,
a few housekeeping items I'll put out there. Well, actually, just one is that China, well, not China, but Russia and Iran have reached an agreement on building a rail system from that will be connecting St. Petersburg all the way to the Persian Gulf, and that is going to be the Rasht Asana railway section will be signed, and the Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak, Polish name, funny enough, generally
mhm,
Polish name. It
yeah.
varies. There's a lot of overlap to names. I'm sure you know, but
Yeah, there's even Novaks in Macedonia. It's an old
yes,
Slavic name.
yeah, they're all over the place. But he was in Tehran on May 16th and 17th, and it was announced during that visit. So, once again, further integration with the rail system, the rails and the pipelines. Once again, you're seeing further integration of. I hate the term because of how abused it has been, but there's really no other way to put it. Further integration of the Eurasian landmass under these economic deals, and like I said, I don't care if you have the most positive or most negative opinion in the world of Russia, China, all these countries. Point being is they're the ones actively shaping the future. And at this point, maybe this isn't entirely the case, but more and more so, the American empire finds itself in the position of being the power that is reacting to the moves. Whereas up
Yeah,
until very recently, the American empire was the one making the moves. Russia, China, Iran, whoever else was reacting. Now it's becoming a much more balanced relationship where they're both making moves and both reacting. It's much more of a, and I hate to use the term again because it's been so overused and abused, a much more multipolar world. And I mean that in the most objective sense, completely value neutral use of the term. The fact that there are multiple poles of power in the world that have arisen, and that the moves that they make are contingent on each other, and it's not just one unipolar power that is making the moves and watching the others react, as we may have seen just even up until a few years ago. The point being is, while maybe I think a lot of people focused on Europe and Ukraine even before the outbreak of full-scale war, there was that Russia's largely been the reactive power on that. We've seen these deals. We've seen the reconciliation between China, the Chinese-led reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And there's really no way to put it in the fact that These are countries that, look, it may fail in the end, just to put all the caveats out there, but these are countries that are actively trying to shape their own destiny instead of just reacting to whatever's thrown in front of them.
Right. And if 2022 is any year to go by, and that is one of the most significant things that happened, was an 11% decrease in world reserve currencies of the US dollar. I have no doubt that we're probably going to see something similar in 2023 happen. There's more and more countries that are going to stop using the American dollar. They're looking at Ukraine and they're looking at Russia and they're saying, besides, we could be next. Um, and America is going to have to make a decision in a few weeks about default or not. Um, it's not good. It's not the horse they want to bet on anymore. And we've said it many, many times. This is why countries like Saudi Arabia are uh, trading in the yuan. Why Russia and India are trading in the ruble and the rupee. But Russia is the second biggest trading partner with India, the biggest so far. Um, the EU is now trying to stop like even basic materials that could be used to construct boots for soldiers. Like they're trying to stop all oil whatsoever. They're trying to hamstring the Indians. Um, it's an impossible
And
task.
you also
They
have to
they
remember that
cannot
the
do it.
the Americans, when it comes to economic trade and negotiation and the use of the U.S. dollar, they're the ones making this a zero sum game. If you use the yuan or the ruble or whatever else in transactions, we're not going to trade with you. Whereas the Russians and Chinese, of course, don't want the U.S. dollar in the market. At this point, they haven't said that if you still use the U.S. dollar, that's a deal breaker. That's a game over for us. So point being is,
Yeah,
it's the Americans who have put themselves in this position of it being a zero sum game, whether you trade with the U.S. dollar or you don't trade with us at all, rather than once again trying to, while it may be a temporary setback, trying to negotiate itself into this growing new dynamic where there still is quite a bit of the pie that the Americans can take if they're willing to be less stubborn about this issue. But here we are. They are being completely stubborn.
yeah,
It's a zero sum issue. You use the US dollar, you don't trade with us at all. And it is, at the end, it's something that is only served to the detriment of the American empire. They, because nobody's looking at this and saying, "Oh, we can't do." I mean, look, this move would have worked 20 years ago, and it did work 20 years ago. But
hmm
the dynamics have changed so much, and the foreign policy planners in Washington are either too ignorant or too arrogant, maybe a little bit of both, to admit that this is the way it still works, and we need to adapt or we're going to sink. And at this point, they seem rather consigned to their fate that they're just going to sink. Or perhaps, once again, maybe they are that arrogant to the point where they believe that, I don't know, eventually India will succumb to our threats after their economy goes into recession
no
from our
way.
sanctions. Well, the only economies suffering from American sanctions are the American economy and the European economies. Russia, look,
Right.
they would be doing better without the sanctions. The Russians are surviving. The Russians have seen increase in economic activity. China, no effect at all. India, no effect at all. These other countries that Russia, China, and India have been trading with, virtually no effect at all. And
Yeah.
it's becoming this thing. You
And
could
China
say you
is has
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say China has now surpassed Japan in automobile exports, and
Insane.
it's also shut down the LGBTQ center. So,
Oh no, they
I mean,
closed an
that's a
American
move. That's
embassy.
a move towards multipolarity, if I ever saw one.
Yeah, well, yeah, they closed down the headquarters of the American Empire's Janissaries. Of course, it's a move towards multipolarity. But
Yep.
it's at the end of the day, you can talk about China, you can talk about their unfair trade practices, whatever. That's irrelevant. And perhaps what they are doing is wrong. I'm not here to cast moral judgments, at least in this particular context. Point being is, most of the world looks at this and thinks that China is offering a much better deal than the Americans are. And you can talk about Well, who wants to be like Saudi Arabia? Who wants to be like Indonesia? Well, nobody's asking you to emulate the way these countries run themselves internally. Point being is these are countries with strategic resources and strategic geographic positions. And look, they might not be as advanced, they might not have as great as a culture as the Western world. That's not the point here. We're talking about raw interests here, and you've completely forsaken them. You had the chance, even in the period of
Right, and America does
decolonization.
the same
Oh
thing.
yeah, absolutely. In all of this, you had the chance to maintain influence over these countries and reap the benefits of their strategic resources and strategic geography, and that was forsaken by you. And you can't complain when the Chinese fill the vacuum that you very clearly left for them.
Yes, yes, and I mean, Erdogan has even said that he's prepared to release 1 million um, Syrian refugees. I mean, this was always a power move that he could use against the Europeans. They didn't succeed the last time he did it, so part of it is just being pragmatic. He's seeing where certain walls are being raised, and places where certain walls are being lowered, and I don't want to say he's reacting, he's shaping things, but he's also reacting to the situation. I think he's paying very close attention to the Arab League meeting. Um, he knows that Turkey is tangential to this region, and they will be expecting him to make certain decisions. The whole point will be to isolate the problem in Syria and Iraq as being just America. Like America is particularly in Syria, right? Because the Kurds themselves, they cannot, without American funding, they cannot succeed. And and it's literally the robbing of the theft of Syrian resources like wheat and oil, but most of all, just the sanctions which inhibit economic growth and the construction of infrastructure that's so badly needed, particularly after 5,000 Syrians died in the earthquakes. Um, anyways, so a lot depends on him. He's been pretty vocal. He has said that uh, Kili, I cannot pronounce his last name. His opponent, Kili Jarokolu or something. Um,
Kamal. I mean,
anyways,
that's
he said
it,
that,
He's a Kamalist with his first name is Kamal.
let's call him
Yeah.
Kamal.
What an absurd
So,
country.
so Kamal, he's criticized Kamal for being someone who isn't pragmatic enough. He has said to Turks that if Kamal wins, he will immediately place sanctions. Kamal has said that he would place sanctions after saying he wouldn't place sanctions. There was also an interview with Erdogan and I believe a British correspondent for CNN. She might have been for the BBC, but I think it was CNN. And she says, "You honestly believe that Biden is meddling in Turkish elections?" Like he said, well, he said, "I'm a dictator and I'm in the middle of elections and I have to go to the second round." That's not what a dictator does. So,
Yeah, Saddam was known for always pushing elections in the second round after failing to secure a majority.
yeah, or the Saudi family, right? Okay. Um, so I thought he handled himself fairly well. Um, of course, for the Americans and for the European elites, it's very important that he loses. Now, he was only a half a point away from winning everything in the first round. Um, the what's his name, Sinan, who was the third
Yeah, he
candidate.
stole about 5% of the vote.
Yes, he had about 5% of the vote, 5.2 to be exact. Now he met with Erdogan, and Sinan represents like the hardcore nationalists. He's sort of like right of Erdogan. That to me is kind of a clear sign that they're making certain deals. And Sinan, after implying that, some of his voters would side with Kamal, this meeting to me tells me that he's strongly wants to suggest that they vote for Erdogan.
Yes,
And
and
it makes sense. It makes sense. Why would Turkey want an American naval base on Crimea? It would completely hem them in.
well, I
It-
do have to say that with the Sinan question, it's not unheard of in the case of both Hungary and Israel of the hard right party siding with the liberals in order to spite the ruling right wing party. So,
Mhm, mhm.
so that's it. Actually, is pretty significant. I wouldn't just say it's a foregone conclusion that Sinan and Erdogan would form some sort of coalition, or Sinan would pledge or endorse Erdogan for the second round, or pledge his support to him. So I would say that while a lot of people would just assume that would be the case, uh, shown time and time again with these strange electoral systems, that is not always the case. And
Yeah.
with Kamal, he said he would. This was almost immediately after the elections. He would not leave Turkey to quote fake leader Erdogan, who orients himself towards Russia. Now it's strange because throughout the campaign trail, Kamal was talking about how Turkish foreign policy towards Russia and the Ukraine situation was generally acceptable. Now I guess the calls came in from Washington in order to change that. So he has taken up a much harsher line on that. Of course, he has said that he would implement sanctions and would probably take a much more pro American line. Erdogan, on the other hand, as we've seen, is much more of a wild card. Currently, he's in dispute with the Western powers. He has a much more hostile orientation towards them. In fact, he was raising the issue over American ships being deployed close to Cyprus this week, which, I mean, clearly that is also, that's not a surprise that something like this would happen. And it does make you wonder that Turkey is in such a position, and it has been put in such a position by Erdogan where it is on that adversarial footing. And even after all of that, seldom do they press the Cyprus issue. It does seem something that even in its, and I don't know, perhaps things will deteriorate even worse where we will see a lot of NATO countries push the Cyprus issue, but even in its worst relations with Turkey it's had since the inception of NATO, nobody wants to touch the Cyprus issue. They're completely satisfied with northern Cyprus being under a Turkish puppet state, which, I mean, strikes me as strange. And I it does make you wonder whether or not this is going to be the next push. Where will they try to bring that back to the foreground? The fact that Turkey is occupying half of Cyprus, but again, the dynamics between Turkey and its neighbors, especially its European neighbors, it's a very strange game because, of course, temporarily the U.S. will support their claims against Turkey. But at the end of the day, if they knew they could get Turkey back in a Western aligned camp by sacrificing the interests of these European and even NATO countries bordering Turkey, they would in a heartbeat. And I don't know. Perhaps that's the deal they've cut with Kamal, as it were. But it's an interesting dynamic. I think Erdogan has re-election in the bag, frankly. But I do think, as I had said previously, what we will see afterwards is attempts at some sort of color revolution or major amount of unrest in Turkey post election, with disputes of the results of the election and calling into question the legitimacy of Erdogan, and really mobilizing the on the ground protesters there, the street movements, and possibly even agitating on the Kurdish issue if need be.
Mhm.
But overall, it's things are going to come to a head because, as we've seen, the American empire, love him or hate him, they want Erdogan gone because he is such an unpredictable quantity. And for the time being, he has oriented himself more and more east and has been consistently orienting himself more and more eastward. And the question is, how are they going to negotiate the Turkish situation if Erdogan does remain in power and if he keeps doing what he does? There's always the, well, maybe not always, but over the past 5 years, there have been the demands to see Turkey expelled from NATO. Once again, we're talking about one of the linchpins of NATO, a country right there with that perfect strategic position towards the Black Sea, with the amount of American air power and military power in the country as it is. It would be a major loss to the alliance if they did lose Turkey. And it would also be burning a lot of bridges that maybe still have some potential to lead to something because, again, if Turkey can be flipped, whether that's by a change in leadership or by some series of events that suddenly turns Erdogan pro-West, which I don't think either of those are likely, they're still sitting on massive stockpiles of ammunition that could very easily be sent to Ukraine if need be. I believe it was actually early on in the war, Turkey was a major supplier of drones to Ukraine. So it's not beyond them to play both sides of these conflicts. We've seen it before, and we will certainly see it again. But it does make you wonder how long the formal relations between the West and Turkey can endure the realistic adversarial relationship. A lot of people think, well, it's absurd. Of course, they're never going to start ripping up treaties, and uh, we won't see the fracturing of NATO. But is that a realistic position at this point? I'm not saying it's going to be anytime soon, but I don't see how the situation with relations between Turkey and the West can continue as adversarial as they are
Mhm.
and have NATO stay in one piece. And I believe it's one of those things. Once one thread comes loose, more and more will over time. It's going to open the door to discontent. Now, a lot, maybe I'm foolish for saying that because a lot of people said that about Brexit, that once the British leaves, it opens the door for others. Now, I will say on that point, that's a fair point. Somebody would make that, and you could also see the further cracking down and further consolidation of NATO if Turkey is shed. That they can't afford to have the prestige loss of another member going out. So they're going to consolidate it. They're going to make it impossible to leave NATO. Once you're in, and you're never getting out. So, I mean, I think there's only two possibilities, and I think it's a matter of when rather than if NATO Turkish ties are severed. And the question is, will they be able to consolidate power and time to stop a complete unraveling? And if so, how harsh of a crackdown will that look like on NATO states? Because I think they will use everything in their arsenal, everything in their power to completely solidify the quote unquote unity of NATO if there is a shedding of a member, especially as major as Turkey.
Yeah, I mean, Erdogan has been adamant about, I mean, that he has no plans on leaving NATO. He wants, I mean, it's impossible, right? Because there's a vice on that's pressing on Turkey that you rightly point out, and he's going to have to inevitably make a decision. Maybe he believes someone else, his successor, will, but he's not ready for it, or Turkey's not ready for it. In any case, he said that, of course, Turkey's a very important part of NATO. It's a partner with NATO. And again, I go back to that interview he had with that female British correspondent, where he said, um, she brought up the S-400s. He says, well, we didn't want the S-400s initially. We wanted the Patriots, but America would not sell them to us. So we need air defense systems. So we bought the S-400s. And that's the reason we're out of the F-35 program. And I just thought, like, that's amazing, because that really sheds light on that situation. Because of course, if you watch Western media, they tell you he bought the S-400 system. They never tell you why he bought it.
Oh yes, and also with the F-35 program, where Turkey was such a pivotal role in that. Now, I think any country receiving F-35 is punishment enough, and that's probably even as harsh as sanctions, given some of the things we know about the F-35. But it was a very strange way that the relationship between Turkey and the West was turned so adversarial because looking at it just raw interests, there was no reason this needed to happen. If they would have just given a little bit of leeway, we wouldn't see them in the position. I mean,
Hmm.
this is the same country that shot down a Russian jet in 2015. This is the same country that, as recently as 2018, 2019, even maybe a little or later than that, going into 2020, was having their proxies and sometimes their direct military forces engaging with Russians in Syria. So, while things have improved, and while I don't think there's going to be any major rift between Turkey and Russia anytime in the near future, it wasn't always that way, and this is a very recent development in terms of where they are. And maybe there are a few threads you could pull to see a much more hostile relationship between Turkey and Russia. I was actually thinking that the outbreak of the Ukraine war might be one of them. Now, as we've seen, it's actually been the exact opposite. But it's this strange forsaking of alliances on the part of the American Empire if they don't exactly conform to every whim of the American Empire. That's not just on the LGBTQ CIA stuff. I know that's the very easy and obvious line, and it's true, don't get me wrong. But even in terms of just raw interest, if you're not doing everything you possibly can in service to the American Empire, then we can't work with you. It's going back to the zero sum game they play with the USD, where it's you either trade with the USD or you don't trade at all. And the only entity that ends up harming is America, because
Hmm.
nobody else is losing out on it. Only the Americans are, because they're not willing to accept a temporary setback in order to gain longevity, where they feel they need to have everything they need to have it now. It's bad empire management, no matter what way you slice it, and no matter how you feel about it. Just looking at the way it's managed, there's no objective way this is considered sane, rational, or reasonable.
Hmm. Hmm.
This is an empire it's panicking.
See, this
It's
the thing is it's like they've chosen like panicking or hiding, making panicking look like it's like a strength. If I think the Americans feel like if they show a sign of weakness, it will be like a house of cards, and this is why they can't afford to acquiesce. Because if they do, then it's over. Then it's really, really over.
I mean it's acting
And
like
for them,
it's acting like a dog backed into a corner where it's going to growl and raise its hair and show its teeth, but it's the one in the corner.
yeah, I I don't it. You're right. It hurt. And it feels that there is nothing else that it can do. It has to go down fighting if it goes down at all. Because if it shows a sign of weakness, it's already over. That I think that's the way they look at it. So they have to keep going along the path that they're on.
Yes, because they've given up every opportunity they can to
Hmm.
cut off a finger to save the hand, so to speak. And I would say, as most recently as Trump coming into office, they could have very easily taken that, went away and licked their wounds, and probably had the American empire in a pretty comfortable position for the next few decades at least. But they were so adamant about that. They were so adamant about maintaining status quo that we can't accept any sort of change or reform, especially not if it's going to make Trump look like the hero, make Trump look like the good guy. Because I mean, look, I know perhaps it's attributing too much to him, and perhaps I'm maybe too romantic about the 2016 era, but there could have been the possibility for a major reform with Trump, both domestically and in terms of foreign
Hmm.
policy, where, yeah, they would have had to concede a lot, but in the long term, it would have kept them in a much more comfortable position. But they chose the only remaining option, which is we're going to double down and we're going to stick on this. and we're either going to
Yep.
win this or we're going to die trying.
Yep.
And I think we're seeing what direction that is going in. The question is, how much damage will they do while going down? That's the real question about the American Empire. How much damage will they inflict on everyone else in their own decline? And you've said it. You were the one who put the idea in my head. I can't shake it now. I think this was back in 2019. That low yield nuclear weapons being used by America at some point in order for a projection of strength is not out of the question. And I think going back
Yeah.
to the idea I've developed about Korea in particular, that Korea is, it's not unlikely that Korea will be the next project the American Empire entrenches itself in. I could see them launching some low yield nuclear weapons on the Korean
Hmm.
Peninsula, especially given North Korea's own arsenal. I said it a few episodes ago, they're willing to irradiate the Korean Peninsula if it means projecting strength to Russia and China. Absolutely. And especially if they can, maybe if it's not even the case, but especially if they can convince people that the North Koreans fired first and they fired in response, that's going to look. That's not going to be a sell for most of the world, but it's going to be a sell for the people they need it to be a sell for, which are domestic populations in the West and also the media class in the West. So I do fear that as a real possibility that it's look undeniable the American empire is going down. Perhaps there are some stops they can pull out to extend their lifespan by whatever arbitrary amount, but it is a question of how much damage are they going to do and how irreparable will that damage be. I mean, especially in the case of something like if they do decide to lob a few nukes at Pyongyang, that, I mean, we're talking about consequences for generations to come. Not just in Korea, but just
Hmm.
the world. I mean, even let's just assume that radiation doesn't spread. There's no environmental issue, which is a bit absurd to think. But the seal that breaks, so to speak, the doors that opens for conduct on the international stage, if that happens again, once again, we're talking about the only country that has ever used nuclear weapons in combat, particularly against the Japanese at the end of World War II, doing it again. What kind of doors is that going to
Yeah.
open?
Hmm.
And like I said, I'm not going to say that's an inevitability, but it's too much of a possibility for comfort in my personal assessment.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree.
But that is all I had. Unless you have any last minute things that we hadn't touched on.
Um, I did have something that was on my mind. Georgia. So just a little bit. Georgia has, after 4 years, has reopened direct flights between itself and Russia. Russia has 1 million Georgians living in it. And of course, the ties and the history between Georgia and Russia go way back. And of course, a lot of Russians live in Georgia, or at least have summer homes or go to vacation there. Now, the president of Georgia, she has said that she will not take any airline that goes. Like, she's signaling, of course. This is a Georgian who was raised and educated in America, naturally. And
And you expect and believe that she doesn't have her own private aircraft? Like, come on.
yeah, exactly. Right. As if, yes. The obvious, like, yeah, of course. You guys got a flight, as if, right? So, yeah. So, you remember she was in New York and had pictures of her being taken on the ferry at the statue of with the Statue of Liberty behind her. Like, it's so cliche, it's so corny. Anyhow, and at that time the protests
Making the
were going
pilgrimage
on
to Mecca.
because yeah, making the pilgrimage to Mecca, and of course, Georgia could not have a law the kind that the Americans have that stops external interference and all sorts of NGOs and groups funded by foreign actors. Uh, Georgia doesn't deserve that. So what happened was, they had a lot of heavy police presence today and yesterday at the airport, but today protests have started. I forget which politician. I don't know if it was the president. Said that this is a bad idea. We shouldn't do this, and so on. And of course, now the protesters have been activated. Mind you, a lot of Georgians have been killed in Ukraine, so there's going to be extra animosity that way. She is also trying to draft a law that would not allow the Russians to have a stay of any more than 3 months. So that's further antagonizing the situation. The other thing I'll mention is there were local elections in Moldova, and Sandu's thugs went in and raided. Now, two pro-Russian politicians were reelected, and I don't know if the results will be respected because Sandu, the president, she's a stooge, just like the president of Georgia. She sent in paramilitary to and police officers to take the ballots away, and there were protests over this. Um, During May 9th, of course, there were Moldovans who still had St. George ribbons on and, Russian flags and all that. So these are two hot spots
And these elections were
in the
in the
Black Sea region.
region with the what is it, the Gagauz, which is the uh, it's a Turkic population that's been there for a number of centuries, correct? If you know
Hmm,
what
hmm.
strangely enough, fully assimilated. I think they speak mostly Romanian. They're all Orthodox, well, most of them at least. But
Yeah,
yeah, it was a very strange event in Moldova. I know exactly what you're getting at.
but that's all I have to add.
Well, wow, believe it or not, this episode was actually under 3 hours. Unbelievable. We're on 2 hours 56 minutes, but I still think we covered a lot of ground. We covered everything we needed to. So,
Yeah,
uh, thank you everyone for tuning into this pretty big episode of the War Report. I know we didn't cover too many topics, but we covered a lot of the grounds in the ones we did. And we'll see you all next time. And goodbye.
goodbye and take care.